The words hit like a slap across her weathered face. You married a bum? A homeless drifter? Mark's voice echoed through the Phoenix neighborhood. Loud enough for Mrs. Chen next door to pause her gardening. Loud enough for other neighbors to appear at their windows. Loud enough to turn private family business into public humiliation. Evelyn Harper stood frozen on her own front porch. The marriage certificate from Las Vegas trembled in her hands. Legal proof of the most desperate decision she had ever made. This proves you have dementia. Her 42-year-old son snatched the document. Waved it like evidence in a courtroom where she was already guilty. Where being 68 meant being incompetent. Where marrying someone for protection meant losing her mind. Mark, please. Please what? Please pretend this is normal? He grabbed her checkbook from her purse. Physically took control of her finances right there on the porch where Harold had welcomed family for 40 years. Where neighbors had shared coffee and holiday cookies and the ordinary kindness of small communities. You were not fit to drive, or live alone, or decide anything. The man beside her said nothing. Liam, her husband of 48 hours. The stranger she had married in a chapel that smelled of stale perfume in desperate hope. He stood quietly while her son destroyed what remained of her dignity. But something in Liam's eyes suggested this wasn't over. Something about his calm confidence made her wonder if Mark was about to discover that homeless gamblers could be more dangerous than children who stole their mother's social security checks. Mom, drive. Peterson wants to see you tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. I'm picking you up at 8:30. Competency evaluation. Mental health assessment. Medical proof that would give Mark legal authority over every decision in her life. Including where she lived, how she spent her money, whether she deserved to keep the house Harold built with his own hands. The neighbors were still watching. Still listening. Still witnessing the moment when a retired school teacher who had raised an ungrateful son discovered that family love had conditions she couldn't meet. But what Mark didn't know was that his homeless stepfather had secrets that would change everything. What he didn't know was about to destroy him. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now let's get started. The fluorescent light above Evelyn Harper's kitchen table hummed its familiar tune. The same tune it had hummed every morning for 23 years. She sat beneath it, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. The kitchen smelled of yesterday's coffee and the faint mustiness that crept through old window seals. Piles of mail surrounded her like fortress walls. White envelopes, brown envelopes, some stamped red, others yellow, all demanding attention she couldn't give. Money she didn't have. A Medicare summary notice lay open before her. The paper felt cheap between her fingers. Bright red letters screamed across the top, coverage denied. Her blood pressure medication, lisinopril, the pills that kept her heart steady for the past 5 years. The pharmacy wanted $47. She had $12 in her checking account. Next to it sat her electric bill. The envelope had been ripped open with shaking hands. Past due, stamped in bold black ink across the top. $138. The Arizona summer pressed against her windows. Heat waves shimmered on the asphalt outside. The air conditioner wheezed in the background. Each breath it took cost money she didn't possess. Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached for her plastic pill organizer. Blue and white compartments. 7 sections for 7 days of hope. The plastic felt smooth under her fingertips. She opened Monday's slot. 2 pills rattled inside. Tuesday's slot. Empty. Her breath caught. Wednesday's slot. Empty. She had been rationing again. Cutting her blood pressure pills in half. Taking them every other day instead of daily. 3 pills short this week. Her heart skipped as the truth settled into her chest like a stone. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window. It illuminated the dust motes floating above the table. Each speck danced in the air like tiny problems she couldn't catch or solve. The house felt larger when she sat alone. Emptier. The silence pressed against her eardrums. Her late husband's coffee mug still sat in the dish drainer. 6 months since the funeral. She couldn't bring herself to put it away. The ceramic was chipped on the handle. Harold's thumb had worn that spot smooth over 34 years of marriage. Some mornings she still made coffee for 2. The sound of a key turning made her jump. The front door creaked open. Mark walked in without knocking. Her son, 42 years old and still treating her house like his personal kingdom. His shoes clicked against the hardwood floor she had mopped yesterday. "Morning, Mom." His voice carried no warmth, no concern, just obligation wrapped in routine politeness. He scanned the kitchen with sharp eyes, taking inventory. His gaze lingered on the stack of bills, the calculator lying next to her checkbook, the empty prescription bottle sitting by the sink. Mark wore his real estate blazer, navy blue with silver buttons. His hair was slicked back with too much gel. He smelled of expensive cologne and morning coffee from somewhere that wasn't here. His fingernails were manicured, clean, the hands of a man who didn't work with them. "How are you feeling?" The question sounded rehearsed, like lines from a script he had memorized but never meant. Evelyn closed the Medicare notice. The paper crinkled under her palm. She didn't want him to see the red letters. The word, denied, felt like a confession of weakness. "I'm fine." Mark's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe her. She could see it in the way he tilted his head, the way his mouth pressed into a thin line. He walked to the counter. His fingers drummed against the granite surface Harold had installed for their anniversary. The sound echoed through the quiet kitchen. From his briefcase, Mark pulled out a folder. Crisp manila with neat labels. Inside were papers, forms with small print and blank signature lines. He set it down carefully, deliberately, like a chess piece positioned for checkmate. "I brought something for you to look at." Evelyn's stomach tightened. She recognized that tone, the same voice he had used when selling houses to elderly clients. Smooth, confident, predatory. She kept her hands folded in her lap. Her wedding ring felt loose on her finger. She had lost weight since Harold died. Not from grief, from rationing food along with pills. Mark opened the folder. The first document was a brochure. Glossy paper with smiling faces. Sunset Pines Assisted Living, printed in cheerful orange letters. The people in the photos looked happy, healthy, well-fed. Nothing like the reality she knew waited behind those walls. "It's just for you to consider." No pressure. But pressure filled the room like thick humidity. It pressed against her chest, made breathing difficult. Mark's eyes watched her every reaction, every twitch of her fingers, every change in her expression. He was reading her like a balance sheet, calculating her value. "The tours are free. We could go this weekend." She didn't answer, couldn't answer. Her throat felt dry. The morning pills sat in Monday's compartment of her organizer. Blood pressure medicine cut in half. Not enough to do its job properly, but enough to last until next week. Maybe. Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. His jaw tightened. Whoever was calling made him angry. Or nervous. He declined the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket. But his movements were quicker now. More urgent. "Mom, we need to talk about practical things." Practical. The word tasted bitter in the air between them, like medicine without sugar coating. Harold had been practical. He planned for everything. Life insurance, savings accounts, a will that protected her. But cancer didn't care about practicality. It took him anyway, left her with half an income and full expenses. Mark reached into his briefcase again. Another folder. This one was thicker, more official. Legal papers with corporate letterheads. The top document had her name typed in bold letters. Evelyn Frances Harper. Seeing it in black ink made her feel smaller somehow. Reduced to a signature line. Power of attorney. It's really just a formality. Nothing about those words felt formal. They felt final, like closing a door she could never open again. Mark's fingertips rested on the papers. His wedding ring caught the light. A thick gold band that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. "Just sign here, and here." He pointed to lines marked with yellow sticky notes. X's drawn in red ink showed her exactly where to surrender control of her life. Her bank accounts, her house, her decisions, everything Harold had worked 40 years to build would become Mark's responsibility. His property. Evelyn's hand moved toward the pen he offered, then stopped. Something in her chest pulled tight. A feeling she couldn't name. Fear mixed with anger, love tangled with betrayal. Her son was asking her to trust him with everything. But his eyes held no tenderness, no sadness, just impatience disguised as concern. "I need to read it first." Mark's smile flickered. For just a moment, the mask slipped. Underneath was something cold, calculating, The expression disappeared so quickly she almost doubted what she had seen. Almost. Of course. Take your time, but don't take too long. The words carried weight beyond their meaning. A deadline wrapped in politeness. Mark glanced at his watch. Platinum with a black leather band. The kind Harold could never afford. The kind that cost more than her annual property tax. I have to make some calls. He stepped into the living room. His voice dropped to a whisper. But the house was small. Sound carried through thin walls and open doorways. She caught fragments of conversation. Numbers, deadlines, something about appraisals and equity loans. Evelyn looked down at the power of attorney document. The legal language blurred together. Terms she didn't understand, consequences she couldn't predict. At the bottom of the page, her signature line waited. Empty, patient, like a trap disguised as salvation. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. The same tune it had hummed for 23 years. But something about it sounded different now. Urgent. Warning her about things she couldn't quite see but somehow felt approaching. Outside, a neighbor walked their dog. Mrs. Chen from next door. She waved through the window. Evelyn lifted her hand to wave back. The gesture felt heavy, like moving through water. Everything felt harder these days. Talking, walking, thinking, even breathing seemed to require more effort than it used to. Mark's voice grew louder in the next room. Frustration creeping into his practiced calm. Someone wasn't giving him the answers he wanted. The timeline he needed. Evelyn strained to listen, to understand what pressures were pushing him to push her. No, it has to be this week. The closing is already scheduled. Closing? What closing? Mark hadn't mentioned selling anything. But his words carried the urgency of money changing hands. Deals being made. Properties being transferred. A chill ran down her spine despite the Arizona heat pressing against the windows. She looked around her kitchen. Harold's coffee mug in the dish drainer. Her pill organizer with its empty compartments. The stack of bills she couldn't pay. The house she couldn't afford to keep. Everything felt temporary suddenly, like sand slipping through fingers she couldn't quite close. Mark returned to the kitchen. His phone was silent now. But his energy had changed. More focused, more determined. He sat across from her at the table where she had eaten breakfast alone for 6 months. Where she would eat dinner alone tonight unless something changed. Have you thought about it? She hadn't. Couldn't think clearly with him watching her. Waiting for her to make a decision that felt less like choice and more like surrender. The pen lay between them on the table. Silver and black. Heavy with possibility and consequence. Mark, I need more time. His smile was sharp now. Patient but predatory. Like a salesman who sensed weakness and moved in for the close. He leaned forward, his cologne mixed with the smell of old coffee and unpaid bills. The combination made her stomach turn. Time is something we don't have much of, Mom. The words hung in the air like smoke. Threatening. Final. Time was running out for something. But what? The Medicare notice crinkled under her nervous fingers. The electric bill stared up from the table. Her empty pill organizer caught the fluorescent light. Everything around her spoke of endings. Of systems failing and support crumbling. Of a life becoming too expensive to maintain. But underneath the fear and confusion, something else stirred. Something Harold had taught her during their years together. When someone pressures you to decide quickly, that's exactly when you should slow down. Mark's phone buzzed again. This time he answered immediately. His voice dropped to a whisper. But one word carried clearly across the small kitchen. A word that made her blood run cold despite the summer heat. Appraisal. 3 days passed like slow torture. The power of attorney documents sat on Evelyn's kitchen table. Untouched. Unsigned. A constant reminder of the choice she couldn't make. Mark called twice each day. His voice grew sharper with each conversation. More insistent. The deadline he refused to explain was approaching. Tuesday morning brought another Medicare denial. This time for her diabetes testing strips. The pharmacy technician's voice crackled through the phone speaker. Professional but tired. She had heard this conversation 1,000 times before. The prior authorization was rejected. Your doctor needs to submit different forms. Evelyn's hands shook as she hung up. Her blood sugar monitor sat on the counter. Useless without strips to test. She had been guessing her insulin doses for a week. Too much could kill her. Too little could do the same. Either way, she was gambling with her life using pills and prayers. The electric bill arrived that afternoon. A yellow envelope this time. Bright as a warning flag. Final notice, printed in red letters across the front. They would shut off her power in 5 days. The Arizona summer stretched ahead like a furnace. Air conditioning wasn't luxury anymore. It was survival. Evelyn sat in her living room. Harold's recliner still bore the impression of his body. The fabric was worn thin where his head had rested during evening news. She could almost hear his voice telling her what to do. But the silence only echoed back her own fears. On Thursday morning, Mark appeared without calling. He found her in the garden, watering tomato plants with recycled dishwater. The vegetables were her only reliable food source now. Free groceries growing in dirt that cost nothing but time and worry. "Mom, we need to finalize this today." His blazer was rumpled. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. Whatever pressure was pushing him had intensified overnight. He clutched his phone like a lifeline. The screen showed 17 missed calls from the same number. "I'm not ready, Mark." Ready doesn't matter anymore. The words came out harsher than he intended. Evelyn stepped backward. Water from the pitcher splashed across her shoes. The drops soaked through her canvas sneakers, made her toes feel cold despite the morning heat. Mark's phone rang again. This time he answered immediately. His voice dropped to an urgent whisper. She caught fragments through the desert breeze. Something about extensions and final warnings. About property values and market timing. About money that wasn't his but needed to be moved quickly. 24 hours. That's all I need. He wasn't talking to her. The conversation was for someone else. Someone who held power Mark desperately needed. Evelyn watched her son pace across the patio. His expensive shoes left marks on the concrete Harold had poured with his own hands. When the call ended, Mark's face had changed. Desperation replaced calculation. Fear crept around the edges of his practiced smile. He looked at her garden, her house, her life, but his eyes saw only dollar signs and deadlines. "Mom, I'm sorry, but this can't wait anymore." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. Legal letterhead, corporate seal. The document looked official, threatening. Words like guardianship hearing and competency evaluation jumped from the page like poison. "I filed a petition. The court will decide if you're capable of making decisions." The world tilted sideways. Evelyn gripped the garden hose to steady herself. Water sprayed across the ground. Dark spots spread across the dry earth like tears. Her own son had declared war on her independence, her dignity, her right to exist as more than a signature on his financial documents. "Mark, you can't. It's already done." The words hit like physical blows. Each syllable carved away another piece of her autonomy, her future. The hearing was scheduled for next Wednesday. 5 days to prove she deserved to control her own life. To demonstrate competency to strangers who would never understand what independence meant to someone who had already lost everything else. That afternoon, Evelyn sat in Harold's chair. The power of attorney papers spread across her lap like a contract with the devil. Sign them and lose control voluntarily. Refuse and let the court strip away her rights anyway. Either path led to the same destination. A assisted living facility where she would wait to die. The house felt different now. Smaller. Like the walls were closing in with each breath. Every room held memories of the life she was about to lose. The kitchen where she had cooked Harold's favorite meals. The bedroom where they had whispered plans for retirement travel that never happened. The garden where she grew vegetables to survive his absence. Friday evening brought a decision born from desperation rather than wisdom. Evelyn counted the money in her jewelry box. $43 in crumpled bills. Wedding gift money from relatives who were long dead. Mad money Harold had insisted she keep hidden. Emergency funds for problems they could never have imagined. She walked to the Greyhound station downtown. The building smelled of diesel fuel and broken dreams. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The same tune her kitchen light sang but louder. More urgent, like a countdown to something inevitable. 1 ticket to Las Vegas. The clerk looked up from her magazine. A woman about Evelyn's age with kind eyes and tired shoulders. She had probably sold thousands of tickets to people running from problems that would be waiting when they returned. Escape was temporary, but sometimes temporary was enough. Round trip? Evelyn hesitated. Round trip implied coming back. returning to Mark's threats and court hearings. To bills she couldn't pay and medicine she couldn't afford. The ticket cost $37. Almost everything she had left. One way. The bus left at 11 p.m. Evelyn sat in the back row. Empty seats surrounded her like shields against judgment. Through the window, Phoenix disappeared into desert darkness. Each mile carried her further from the competency hearing, from Mark's demands, from the life that had become a prison disguised as home. Las Vegas appeared at dawn like a mirage made of neon and concrete. The city never slept, never stopped moving, never asked uncomfortable questions about age or competency or the right to make bad decisions. It welcomed everyone equally, especially those with nothing left to lose. The casino floor overwhelmed her senses. Lights flashed in patterns designed to hypnotize. Music played without melody. Voices blended into white noise punctuated by the electronic chiming of slot machines. The air tasted of cigarette smoke and desperate hopes. Evelyn found a penny slot machine in a quiet corner. The chair was comfortable, padded vinyl that supported her back. She fed $5 into the machine. Harold's emergency money transformed into credits on a digital display. Numbers that meant nothing and everything depending on luck she had never possessed. The man at the next machine looked familiar somehow. Gray hair, weathered hands, a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. He counted quarters with fingers stained by years of honest work. His Medicare card lay on the machine's coin tray. Red, white, and blue plastic that promised health care but delivered disappointment. Damn thing's good for scraping lottery tickets. That's about it. His voice carried the weight of shared frustration. Evelyn looked at her own Medicare card, still tucked in her purse next to the bus ticket and $3 remaining. The man was right. Government promises meant nothing when pharmacies demanded cash payments for life-sustaining medication. I'm Liam. He extended a hand calloused by work Mark would never understand. Real work that built things instead of selling them. That created value instead of extracting it from vulnerable people who couldn't fight back. Evelyn. Her name felt strange on her tongue. For months, she had been Mom to Mark, Mrs. Harper to bill collectors, patient to doctors who prescribed medicine she couldn't afford. Being Evelyn again felt like remembering how to breathe. They talked between spins, shared stories about ungrateful children and government systems that failed the people who needed them most. Liam bought drinks with quarters he couldn't spare. Cheap whiskey that burned away the taste of disappointment. Evelyn hadn't touched alcohol since Harold's funeral, but tonight felt like a special occasion. The last night of her independence demanded celebration. My kids think I'm crazy too. Liam's words carried bitter truth. His own children had tried to have him declared incompetent. Wanted to seize his assets and warehouse him in a facility where he couldn't interfere with their inheritance plans. The stories sounded familiar, too familiar. They don't understand what we've been through, what we've built. The whiskey made everything easier to discuss. Pain became abstract. Fear transformed into philosophy. They talked about dignity and respect. About the right to make mistakes without permission from people who had never earned the authority to judge. You know what the problem is? Liam leaned closer. His breath smelled of alcohol and honesty. Around them, slot machines continued their electronic songs. Players fed money into dreams that would never pay off. But for the first time in months, Evelyn didn't feel alone in her losses. Kids today think caring means controlling. They can't tell the difference. The words hit like truth often did. Painful and illuminating at the same time. Mark called his behavior love, protection, practical concern for her welfare. But love didn't file competency hearings. Love didn't threaten guardianship to force compliance. Love didn't reduce a lifetime of independence to a signature on legal documents. If I had someone like you in my corner, maybe they'd back off. Liam's suggestion hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and consequence. Evelyn's wedding ring caught the casino lights. Harold had been gone 6 months. But his promise to protect her had died with him. Now she needed protection from the son he had loved unconditionally. Marriage overrides children's authority. Legal fact. The words were slurred by whiskey but clear in meaning. A husband's rights superseded a son's claims. Even a husband acquired in desperation could shield her from Mark's guardianship petition. The idea was crazy, dangerous, perfect. The drinks kept coming. Liam paid with quarters that multiplied mysteriously. His wallet seemed deeper than his appearance suggested. But Evelyn was too grateful for companionship to question the mathematics of their evening. For the first time since Harold's death, someone listened without judging. Cared without demanding. Offered help without expecting control. To new beginnings. Liam raised his glass. The whiskey gleamed under casino lights. Amber liquid that promised courage to people who had forgotten how to be brave. Evelyn lifted her own drink. The glass felt heavy in her hand. Weighted with decisions she wasn't sober enough to understand fully. To freedom. The word tasted different on her tongue. Freedom from Mark's demands. Freedom from court hearings and competency evaluations. Freedom to make mistakes without permission from people who had never earned the right to judge her choices. The casino spun around them like a carousel made of lights and sound. Evelyn's head felt light, disconnected from her body. The whiskey had done its job too well. Reality blurred into dream. Fear transformed into reckless courage. The competency hearing seemed years away instead of days. Liam's hand found hers across the narrow space between slot machines. His fingers were warm, steady, real in a way that nothing else had felt for months. Through the alcoholic haze, she made a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. Let's do it. The words escaped before wisdom could stop them. 3 simple syllables that would change everything. Transform a widow into a wife. A victim into a partner. A woman facing guardianship into someone with legal protection from her own son's ambitions. Somewhere in the casino's maze of corridors and false promises, there had to be a wedding chapel. Las Vegas specialized in quick ceremonies for people who needed immediate solutions to impossible problems. 24-hour marriages for 24-hour emergencies. Liam squeezed her hand gently. His touch carried reassurance she had forgotten how to expect from another human being. Someone who understood what it meant to be abandoned by children who should have protected instead of exploited. Who offered partnership instead of guardianship. Are you sure? The question came too late. Certainty was a luxury she couldn't afford. Mark's deadline waited in Phoenix like a trap disguised as concern. The competency hearing loomed like a judgment day she was destined to fail. Certainty belonged to people with choices. She had only desperate hope disguised as courage. I've never been more sure of anything. The lie tasted sweet mixed with whiskey and the promise of protection. Tomorrow would bring consequences she couldn't predict. Regret she couldn't undo. But tonight offered something she hadn't felt since Harold's diagnosis. The illusion that someone cared enough to stand beside her instead of behind her waiting for her to fall. The slot machines continued their electronic songs. Other players fed coins into dreams that probably wouldn't pay off. But for Evelyn, the real gambling was just beginning. Marriage to a stranger. Protection from a son. Freedom that might cost more than she could afford to pay. But the alternative was worse. Guardianship. Competency hearings. Assisted living facilities where independence went to die. At least this gamble was her choice. Her decision. Her last act of defiance against people who thought love meant control. The casino lights blurred into colorful streams. The whiskey had done its work completely now. Reality and dream merged into a single moment of reckless possibility. Tomorrow would bring questions she couldn't answer. But tonight offered hope she couldn't refuse. Consciousness returned slowly, like climbing out of a deep well. Evelyn's head pounded with the rhythm of her heartbeat. Each pulse sent waves of pain through her skull. The unfamiliar ceiling above her was stained with water damage. Brown spots that looked like continents on a map she couldn't read. The smell hit her next. Stale cigarette smoke embedded in cheap carpet. Disinfectant that had given up fighting losing battles against decades of human desperation. The air conditioner rattled in the window. A mechanical wheeze that reminded her of Harold's last breaths. She was lying on a bed that sagged in the middle. The mattress springs pressed against her spine through fabric that had forgotten softness. Sunlight leaked through curtains the color of old mustard. The light felt aggressive, accusatory. It illuminated a room that charged by the hour for privacy and asked no questions about the guests who rented it. Her mouth tasted like copper pennies and regret. The whiskey had left its mark in dehydration and nausea. But worse than physical discomfort was the growing awareness that something terrible had happened. Something she couldn't quite remember through the alcoholic fog that clouded the previous evening. On the nightstand next to her reading glasses lay a piece of paper. Official letterhead, gold embossed seal, the kind of document that changed lives whether people wanted them changed or not. Her hands shook as she reached for it. The paper crinkled like dry leaves. Certificate of marriage, State of Nevada. The words swam into focus slowly. Her name typed in neat black letters. Evelyn Frances Harper. Next it, another name she recognized but barely knew. Liam Patrick Vance. Both signatures scrawled in handwriting that looked drunk. Desperate. Final. The date was yesterday. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. She had gotten married to a stranger in a Las Vegas chapel while too intoxicated to remember the ceremony. The marriage was legal, binding, completely insane. A snoring sound made her turn. Liam lay on the floor next to the bed, fully clothed in the same flannel shirt and worn jeans from the casino. His face looked different in daylight. Older, worn by experiences she couldn't guess, but peaceful in a way that suggested he slept better than she did. Panic rose in her chest like floodwater. What had she done? Mark would use this as proof of her incompetence. Marriage to a homeless gambler would be exhibit A in his guardianship case. She had handed him the weapon to destroy what remained of her independence. The motel room felt smaller with each breath. Walls painted institutional beige pressed closer together. The single window looked out onto a parking lot where broken dreams went to rust. Cars with expired tags and shattered windshields. Vehicles that had traveled too far from home and couldn't afford the journey back. Evelyn's purse lay open on a chair that had lost its stuffing years ago. Her bus ticket was still there, but everything else felt different now. Changed by a decision made in whiskey-soaked desperation. She was married to a man she met 12 hours ago. A stranger who was now legally entitled to make decisions about her life. Her Medicare card lay scattered on the stained carpet. Red, white, and blue plastic that promised health care but delivered disappointment. Next it, her blood pressure medication bottle. Empty. She had forgotten to take her pills last night. The first time in 5 years she had missed a dose. Liam stirred on the floor. His eyes opened slowly, gray eyes that seemed clearer than they had any right to be after the amount of alcohol they had consumed. He sat up carefully, moved like a man accustomed to waking up in unfamiliar places with unfamiliar consequences. Good morning, Mrs. Vance. The name hit her like a physical blow. Mrs. Vance. She wasn't Mrs. Harper anymore, wasn't Harold's widow, wasn't even Evelyn Frances Harper according to the state of Nevada. She was someone else entirely. Someone married to a man who scraped lottery tickets with his Medicare card. Liam, what have we done? Her voice came out smaller than intended. Frightened, like a child who had broken something precious and couldn't fix it. The marriage certificate lay between them on the bed like evidence of a crime they had committed against common sense. We protected ourselves. His voice carried no regret. No panic, just calm certainty that made her feel even more confused. How could he be so relaxed about a decision that would destroy her relationship with Mark? That would be used as proof of her mental incompetence in court? Mark will say I've lost my mind. Maybe Mark is the one who's lost something. Liam stood slowly, moved to the window, pulled back the mustard-colored curtains. Sunlight flooded the room, harsh and unforgiving. It revealed details she hadn't noticed in the panic of waking up. Liam's clothes were wrinkled but clean. His shoes were worn but expensive. Real leather that had been cared for by someone who understood quality. We need to get back to Phoenix. The words felt heavy in her mouth. Phoenix meant facing Mark, explaining the marriage certificate, watching his fury transform into legal action. The competency hearing was in 5 days. Now she would have to defend not just her mental state but her decision to marry a homeless gambler in a moment of alcoholic desperation. Not yet. Liam's voice was firm, decisive, like a man who had made harder decisions than this one. He turned from the window. The harsh sunlight behind him made his features difficult to read, but his posture suggested confidence she couldn't understand or share. I need to make a phone call first. He pulled a cell phone from his pocket. Not the cheap prepaid device she expected a homeless man to carry. This was expensive, modern, the kind of phone Mark owned. The kind that cost more than her monthly grocery budget. Liam stepped outside. His voice carried through the thin motel walls. She caught fragments of conversation. Words that didn't match his appearance or the story she had constructed about his life. Terms like assets, and legal representation, and corporate accounts. While he talked, Evelyn gathered her scattered possessions. Medicare card, empty prescription bottle, bus ticket that was now useless. Her purse felt heavier somehow. Weighted down by decisions she couldn't undo and consequences she couldn't predict. The marriage certificate stared up at her from the bed. Legal proof of the most reckless decision she had ever made. Harold would have been horrified. 40 years of careful planning and responsible choices. Now she was married to a stranger who might be exactly what he appeared to be. Or might be something else entirely. When Liam returned, his demeanor had changed. More focused. More purposeful. He packed his few belongings with efficient movements. Like a man who had done this many times before. Who knew how to disappear when circumstances required it. We're taking a different bus. Where? Phoenix. But not the way you came. The statement made no sense. But nothing about the last 12 hours made sense. She was married to a homeless gambler who owned an expensive phone and spoke about legal representation with casual authority. Reality had become negotiable. They left the motel without checking out. Walked through streets that looked different in daylight. Las Vegas, stripped of its nighttime illusions, revealed itself as a desert city where people came to lose money they couldn't afford. To make decisions they would regret. To transform themselves into someone else for a few hours before reality demanded payment. The bus station was crowded with people carrying the same expressions she felt on her own face. Confusion mixed with determination. Fear disguised as adventure. They were all running from something. Toward something. The buses didn't ask which direction was escape and which was surrender. Liam bought their tickets. Paid cash from a wallet that seemed deeper than his appearance suggested. The money came out in neat bills. Not the crumpled currency of desperation but the organized wealth of someone who counted in larger denominations. First class. The words surprised her. Homeless gamblers didn't travel first class. But Liam handed her a ticket that promised comfort she couldn't afford. Legroom and air conditioning and freedom from questions about her life choices. The bus that arrived was newer than the one that had brought her to Vegas. Cleaner. More comfortable. The kind of transportation that cost more than she had ever spent on travel. But Liam settled into his seat like he belonged there. Like first class was normal instead of luxury. As Phoenix approached through the desert heat, Evelyn's anxiety intensified. Mark would be waiting, furious about her disappearance, armed with new evidence of her incompetence. The marriage certificate felt like a loaded weapon in her purse. One that would explode in her face the moment he discovered it. What do I tell him? Tell him the truth. Liam's advice was simple, impossible. The truth was that she had married a stranger to avoid guardianship. That she had acted from desperation rather than love. That she had no idea who her new husband really was or what he wanted from their legal arrangement. He'll use it against me. Let him try. The confidence in Liam's voice was unsettling. How could a homeless gambler be so certain about legal battles with someone like Mark? Her son was a successful real estate agent. He understood contracts and courts and how to manipulate systems to his advantage. The bus pulled into Phoenix as the afternoon heat reached its peak. The desert sun pressed down like divine judgment. Everything looked the same as when she had left. But she was different now. Married, protected, terrified. Mark's car was in her driveway. He had been waiting, probably searching the house for clues about her whereabouts. Probably calling hospitals and morgues and anyone who might have information about a missing elderly woman. Who had finally proved she was incompetent to live independently. Liam walked her to the front door. His presence beside her felt both comforting and dangerous. Protection that might cost more than she could afford. Alliance with someone she didn't understand. But Mark's car in her driveway reminded her that the alternative was worse. The front door opened before she could use her key. Mark stood in the doorway. His face cycled through relief, anger, and calculation in rapid succession. He was wearing the same clothes from yesterday. Wrinkled, stained with coffee and stress sweat. He looked like he hadn't slept. Where have you been? The question came out sharp. Accusatory. Like a prosecutor addressing a defendant who had violated bail conditions. Mark's eyes moved from her face to Liam standing beside her. His expression hardened. Suspicion replaced concern. Who is this? Evelyn's throat felt dry. The moment she had been dreading was here. The marriage certificate in her purse felt heavier than lead. Evidence of a decision that would change everything. That would give Mark exactly the weapon he needed to destroy what remained of her independence. This is Liam. The introduction sounded inadequate, incomplete. It didn't explain who Liam was or why he was standing on her porch or why he seemed so calm while she felt like she might collapse from anxiety. Mark's realtor instincts were engaged now. Reading people, evaluating threats, calculating advantages. Mom, you can't just disappear like that. I called the police. The words hit like accusations. She was being treated like a runaway child instead of a grown woman who had made a decision to leave her own house for 2 days. Mark's assumption of authority over her movements proved the point Liam had made about children thinking caring meant controlling. I went to Las Vegas. Las Vegas? Mom, that's completely irresponsible. You don't have money for trips. Mark's voice grew louder, more frustrated. He was performing for an audience now, demonstrating to Liam that he was the responsible party, the one who understood practical concerns like budgets and limitations, the one who should be making decisions about her life. I needed to get away. From what? From people who care about you? The question was rhetorical, designed to make her feel guilty for wanting independence, for resisting his helpful guidance, for refusing to sign documents that would solve all her problems by transferring them to his capable hands. Liam stepped forward. His movement was subtle but significant, positioning himself between Evelyn and Mark's verbal assault. The gesture was protective, possessive. It changed the dynamics of the conversation in ways that made Mark's eyes narrow with suspicion. You need to leave now. Mark's words were directed at Liam. Dismissive, authoritative, the tone he used with trespassing homeless people who wandered onto properties he was showing. People who didn't belong in spaces reserved for more valuable human beings. Actually, I belong here now. Liam's response was calm, matter of fact, devastating. The words hung in the desert air like smoke from an explosion. Mark's face went through several expressions before settling on confusion mixed with outrage. What does that mean? Evelyn's hand moved to her purse. The marriage certificate waited inside like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Once she revealed it, there would be no going back. No undoing the consequences. No pretending this was temporary insanity instead of permanent change. We got married. The words came out quietly, almost whispered, but they had the impact of a shout. Mark's face went pale, then red, then pale again. He stared at her like she had announced she was joining a cult or donating her organs to science while still alive. You what? We got married in Las Vegas. She pulled out the marriage certificate. Official paper with gold seals and signatures that made insanity legally binding. Mark stared at the document like it was written in a language he couldn't read. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound. This is insane. The word she had been dreading finally emerged. Insane. Proof of incompetence. Evidence that she needed protection from her own decisions. Mark's case for guardianship had just received the evidence it needed to succeed. You married a homeless bum? The words came out loud enough for neighbors to hear. Mrs. Chen's curtains moved in the house next door. Other windows revealed faces pressed against glass. Mark was creating a public spectacle, making sure everyone witnessed his mother's latest act of senile irresponsibility. Liam isn't homeless. The words came out automatically. Defensive. But as soon as she said them, Evelyn realized she had no idea what Liam actually was. She knew nothing about his life, his background, his real circumstances. She had married a complete stranger based on appearance and assumption. Look at him. Mark gestured at Liam's flannel shirt and worn jeans. The clothes of a man who had spent too many nights in places that didn't care about appearance or dignity. Evidence that supported every negative assumption about homeless gamblers who preyed on vulnerable elderly women. This proves you have dementia. The word felt like a diagnosis delivered without medical training. Dementia, the condition that would justify guardianship. That would explain why a rational woman would marry a stranger to avoid signing power of attorney documents. That would give Mark legal authority to make all future decisions about her life. Mark pulled out his phone. His movements were quick, desperate, like someone calling for help during an emergency. But the emergency was Evelyn's continued independence. Her refusal to surrender control voluntarily meant he would have to take it by force. I'm calling the police. On what grounds? Liam's voice was calm, legal, like someone who understood law enforcement procedures better than a real estate agent should. Mark paused. His finger hovered over the phone screen. He was discovering that marriage certificates carried legal weight even when they involved decisions he disapproved of. Elder abuse. He's obviously taking advantage. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Elder abuse. The charge that could make marriage invalid. That could send Liam to prison and Evelyn to a facility where she would be protected from her own poor judgment by people who knew better. That's a serious allegation. Liam stepped closer to Mark. The movement was subtle but threatening. Like a chess piece moving into position for checkmate. Mark stepped backward. His confidence wavered in the face of someone who didn't seem intimidated by threats of police involvement. You'll have to prove I've stolen money or property. The challenge was quiet, professional, like someone who understood the legal requirements for elder abuse charges. Mark's face grew redder. His plans were encountering resistance he hadn't expected from someone he had dismissed as harmless. Mom, get in the house. We're calling Dr. Peterson. Dr. Peterson was her family physician. The one who would be asked to evaluate her mental competence. Who would be pressured to find evidence of dementia that justified guardianship proceedings. Mark was escalating the situation. Moving from threats to action. I don't need a doctor. You married a vagrant. The word vagrant echoed across the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen's front door opened slightly. Other neighbors had given up pretending they weren't watching. Mark was ensuring that everyone knew about his mother's latest act of senile irresponsibility. I married someone who cares about my well-being. The words surprised her as she said them. They might even be true. Liam had offered protection when her own son offered only control. Partnership instead of guardianship. But the truth was she didn't know what Liam actually offered beyond a legal shield against Mark's ambitions. He's after your house. Mark's accusation revealed more than he intended. The house. The equity Harold had spent 30 years building. The asset that would solve Mark's financial problems if he could access it through power of attorney or guardianship proceedings. My house is safe. Liam's statement was simple, definitive, but it carried weight beyond its brevity. Like someone who understood property law better than appearance suggested. Mark's eyes narrowed. The homeless gambler was speaking with authority that didn't match his circumstances. Who are you really? The question Mark should have asked from the beginning. Who was Liam Vance? What did he want? Why was he so calm about legal challenges? That should terrify a homeless man with no resources? The marriage certificate listed an address, a social security number, information that could be verified. I'm your mother's husband. The answer was legally correct but practically meaningless. Husband could mean anything. Protection or exploitation. Security or danger. Love or convenience. Evelyn stared at the man she had married and realized she was as confused as Mark about who he really was. Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. His face went pale. Whoever was calling was someone he couldn't ignore. Someone whose timeline was more pressing than his mother's marriage crisis. He answered immediately. I know. I'm handling it. The conversation was brief, tense, full of deadlines and consequences Mark couldn't meet. When he hung up, his desperation was visible. Whatever pressure had been pushing him to force the power of attorney had intensified overnight. Mom, we'll discuss this later. The retreat was temporary, strategic. Mark was regrouping, planning his next move. The marriage certificate had complicated his guardianship case but not destroyed it. Marriage to a homeless vagrant could still be evidence of incompetence if presented properly. He left without saying goodbye to Liam, without acknowledging the marriage, without accepting that his mother had made a decision that changed the balance of power in their relationship. The sound of his car door slamming echoed across the neighborhood like a gunshot. Evelyn and Liam stood alone on the porch. The afternoon heat pressed down like divine judgment. Everything looked the same as when she had left for Las Vegas. But she was different now. Married, protected, terrified about what protection would cost. What happens now? Now we go inside and figure out what Mark is really after. Liam's voice carried confidence she couldn't share. But for the first time since Harold's death, someone was standing beside her instead of behind her waiting for her to fall. Whether that was salvation or just a different kind of danger remained to be seen. The marriage certificate crinkled in her purse as they walked through the front door. Legal proof of a decision made in desperation. Evidence of protection that might cost more than she could afford. But the alternative had been guardianship. Control by a son who looked at her house like it was already a carcass to be butchered. Whatever came next, she would face it as Mrs. Vance instead of the incompetent widow Mark wanted her to be. The transformation was terrifying, liberating, completely insane, but it was her choice. Her decision. Her marriage to a stranger who might be exactly what he appeared to be. Or might be something else entirely. The house felt different with Liam inside. Smaller somehow, like the walls had shifted closer together to accommodate another person's presence. Evelyn moved through rooms that had been hers alone for 6 months. Now they belonged to someone else too. A stranger who was legally entitled to everything Harold had spent 40 years building. Mark's threat echoed in the silence. Dr. Peterson would be called. Questions would be asked about her mental state. About her ability to make rational decisions. About whether marriage to a homeless vagrant proved she needed protection from herself. Liam sat at Harold's kitchen table. The same chair where Mark had tried to force her signature 3 days ago. But where Mark had looked predatory, Liam appeared thoughtful. He studied the power of attorney documents Mark had left behind. His finger traced legal language with familiarity that didn't match his appearance. These papers transfer everything. His voice carried understanding of legal documents that surprised her. Homeless gamblers didn't usually parse contract language with such precision. But Liam read the fine print like someone who had reviewed similar agreements before. Mark said they were just formalities. Nothing about this is formal. Liam pointed to a clause buried in paragraph 7. Small print that would give Mark immediate authority to sell the house. To liquidate assets. To move her into whatever facility he chose regardless of her preferences or the promises in his glossy brochures. I would lose everything. You would lose the right to lose everything. The distinction hit harder than expected. Losing money was temporary. Losing the right to make financial decisions was permanent. Mark wasn't just asking for her assets. He was demanding her autonomy. Her identity as an independent human being. Evening brought another problem. Evelyn opened her pill organizer. Monday's compartment was empty. Tuesday was empty. Wednesday held one small white tablet cut in half. Her blood pressure medication was almost gone. The pharmacy had refused her prescription without payment she couldn't afford. Liam watched her divide the half pill into smaller pieces. Rationing medicine that should be taken daily. The mathematics of poverty applied to healthcare. Choosing between electricity and medication. Between food and insulin strips. Between dignity and survival. How long has this been happening? Since Harold died. The words came out matter-of-factly. Like admitting to a chronic condition that couldn't be cured. Harold's pension had provided stability. His death had cut their income in half while expenses remained the same. Simple mathematics with devastating consequences. Medicare doesn't cover everything. Nothing covers everything. Liam's response carried understanding of systems that failed the people who needed them most. Government promises that disappeared when pharmaceutical companies demanded cash payments. Insurance that covered procedures but not the medications that made procedures unnecessary. Show me the bills. The request felt invasive, personal, but Liam was her husband now. Legally entitled to see the evidence of her financial failures. The proof that she couldn't manage her own life effectively. Evelyn gathered the stack of envelopes from the kitchen counter. Electric bill, water bill, property tax notice, Medicare explanation of benefits with denial stamps in red ink. Credit card statements showing minimum payments that were maximum efforts. The mathematics of poverty laid out in black and white. Liam studied each document carefully. His expression grew more serious with every page. The numbers told a story of gradual financial destruction. Death by 1,000 small cuts. Bills that grew larger while income grew smaller. A deficit that would eventually consume everything. The property taxes alone will bankrupt you. The statement felt like a medical diagnosis. Terminal illness expressed in financial terms. Arizona property values had increased faster than fixed incomes could accommodate. The house Harold had bought for security had become a liability that would destroy the life it was supposed to protect. Mark knows this. Of course he knows. Liam's voice carried disgust. Mark was a real estate agent. He understood property values and tax assessments better than his own mother. He had watched her struggle with bills she couldn't pay while sitting on equity she couldn't access, deliberately allowing her financial situation to deteriorate. He's been waiting for you to become desperate enough. The words revealed a strategy more calculated than she had imagined. Mark hadn't been trying to help. He had been creating conditions that would force her to accept his help, engineering a crisis that would make his solution seem inevitable. The phone calls about appraisals. Evelyn remembered fragments of Mark's conversations, references to property values and market timing, to closing schedules and equity loans. He had been planning to sell her house before she agreed to let him. Using power of attorney to transfer assets she wasn't ready to surrender. He's already committed to something. Liam's observation felt like diagnosis of a disease she hadn't known she was carrying. Mark needed her house sale to proceed. Had probably promised the equity to someone who didn't care about his mother's housing preferences. Who wouldn't accept delays caused by her stubborn refusal to be practical. The phone rang. Evelyn's number displayed on the screen she couldn't reach from her chair. The machine answered after 4 rings. Mark's voice filled the kitchen. Tense, angry, desperate. Mom, drive. Peterson wants to see you tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. I'm picking you up at 8:30. The message felt like a summons. Medical evaluation disguised as healthcare. Dr. Peterson would be asked to find evidence of dementia, to provide documentation that would support guardianship proceedings, to transform marriage to a homeless vagrant into proof of mental incompetence. Don't answer the door. Liam's advice was simple, illegal, completely reasonable. She didn't have to submit to evaluations she hadn't requested. Didn't have to prove her sanity to people who had already decided she was crazy. Didn't have to cooperate with her own destruction. He'll use it against me. He's already using everything against you. The truth was liberating and terrifying. Mark had declared war on her independence. Nothing she did would change his strategy. Cooperation wouldn't earn mercy. Resistance wouldn't make things worse. She was fighting for survival whether she chose to fight or not. That night, Evelyn lay in bed listening to unfamiliar sounds. Liam slept on the living room couch. His presence changed the acoustics of the house. Different breathing patterns, different sleep sounds. The knowledge that someone else was there changed how silence felt. Harold's side of the bed remained empty. 6 months wasn't long enough to stop reaching for someone who would never be there again. But having another person in the house made the loneliness feel less permanent. Less like a life sentence. Morning brought pounding on the front door. Mark's voice carried through the wood. Demanding, insistent, punctuated by threats about police involvement and medical emergencies. He had brought reinforcements. Dr. Peterson's voice joined the chorus of concern about her welfare. Mrs. Harper, please open the door. Dr. Peterson's participation felt like betrayal. 40 years of medical relationship reduced to collaboration in her son's guardianship scheme. The doctor who had treated her through menopause and Harold's cancer was now helping Mark prove she was mentally incompetent. Evelyn and Liam sat in Harold's living room. Curtains drawn against neighbors who might be watching. Phone unplugged to prevent additional pressure. The house felt like a fortress under siege. Protection that might become a prison if they couldn't break the cycle of escalation. They can't force entry. Liam's voice was calm, legal, like someone who understood the limits of medical authority. Dr. Peterson could express concerns but couldn't break down doors. Mark could demand evaluations but couldn't compel them without court orders that would take time to obtain. What if they call the police? Marriage changes things. The statement was cryptic but comforting. Liam seemed to understand legal complexities she couldn't navigate alone. Husband's rights versus son's concerns. Spouse's authority versus child's worries. The law favored marriage over family relationships in ways that might protect her. The pounding continued for 20 minutes. Threats escalated from medical concerns to police involvement to emergency interventions. But eventually the voices faded. Car doors slammed. Engines started. The siege was temporary, strategic. Mark was regrouping for another approach. He'll be back. Let him come. Liam's confidence was unsettling. How could someone in his position be so certain about legal battles with established professionals? Mark had resources, connections, the kind of authority that homeless gamblers couldn't challenge successfully. But Liam spoke like someone who had faced similar challenges before. Who are you really? The question had been building since Las Vegas. Liam's behavior didn't match his appearance. His knowledge exceeded his circumstances. His calm confidence suggested resources that contradicted everything visible about his situation. Someone who understands what you're going through. The answer was true but incomplete. Liam pulled a business card from his wallet. Expensive paper with gold lettering. The kind of card Mark would envy. Vance Hospitality Group, Property Management and Development. The business card felt heavier than paper should. It revealed nothing and everything about the man she had married. Liam wasn't homeless, wasn't a vagrant, wasn't the helpless gambling addict Mark had dismissed as harmless. You own hotels? I own the company that owns the hotels. The distinction was massive. Hotel ownership was impressive. Hotel company ownership was corporate power on a scale that dwarfed Mark's real estate ambitions. Liam wasn't just wealthy. He was seriously, systemically, generationally wealthy. Why were you in Las Vegas dressed like someone my children wouldn't recognize? The explanation revealed familiar pain. Liam's own family had tried to seize his assets, declare him incompetent, use his age as evidence that he needed protection from his own decisions. He had been hiding from children who looked at his wealth like Mark looked at her house. They think you're dead? They think I'm missing. The difference was legally significant. Missing persons could return with full authority over their assets. Dead people couldn't reclaim property that had already been distributed to grateful heirs. Liam was conducting his own experiment in independence, testing whether someone his age could disappear and re-emerge without family interference. The marriage makes you my heir. The implication was staggering. Marriage to Liam didn't just protect her from Mark's guardianship schemes. It made her a potential billionaire. Someone with resources to fight legal battles that would have destroyed her alone. Someone with enough money to buy Mark's cooperation if necessary. I don't want your money. I don't want your house. The exchange was honest. Neither wanted the other's assets. Both wanted protection from children who confused caring with controlling. Marriage was a legal shield that benefited both parties without requiring romance or emotional complications. What do we do now? Now we call a lawyer. Liam's phone appeared again. Expensive technology disguised as ordinary communication. He dialed a number from memory. Spoke with quiet authority to someone who addressed him as Mr. Vance, with respectful familiarity. We need help with a guardianship challenge. The conversation was brief, professional, devastating for anyone listening who understood the implications. Liam wasn't hiring a lawyer. He was activating legal resources that had been waiting for his call. Corporate attorneys who specialized in family law challenges involving significant assets. They'll be here in an hour. The statement transformed their situation completely. Mark's threats about court evaluations would be met with legal representation that could bankrupt him. His guardianship petition would face opposition from attorneys who charged more per hour than most people earned per year. What about the house? What about it? Liam's question revealed the answer. Her house was no longer the primary asset at stake. Marriage to someone worth hundreds of millions had changed the mathematics of their conflict. Mark's guardianship scheme was designed to capture thousands in home equity. It couldn't withstand opposition funded by billions in corporate resources. The phone rang again. Mark's voice on the answering machine sounded different now. Less confident, more desperate. Someone had told him about the business card. About Liam's real identity. About the legal representation that was already being mobilized. Mom, we need to talk. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. The word that meant Mark had discovered his homeless vagrant was actually a corporate titan. That his easy guardianship case had become a legal nightmare. That his mother's crazy marriage was the smartest decision she could have made. But it was too late for misunderstandings. Too late for reconciliation. Too late for Mark to pretend his motives had been pure. He had revealed his true intentions. Demonstrated his willingness to destroy her independence for his financial benefit. Shown that love meant control in his emotional vocabulary. Don't answer. Liam's advice was unnecessary. Evelyn had no intention of discussing anything with someone who had tried to steal her autonomy, who had engineered her desperation to force compliance, who had looked at her life like it was already a carcass to be butchered. The lawyers arrived in cars that cost more than Mark's annual income. Professional intimidation disguised as legal consultation. They transformed her living room into a war room where strategies were planned for battles Mark couldn't afford to fight. The guardianship petition will be withdrawn. The statement came from an attorney whose hourly rate exceeded Evelyn's monthly income. Mark's legal challenge was over before it had officially begun. Corporate resources had crushed his ambitions like an elephant stepping on an ant. What about Dr. Peterson? Medical opinions can be purchased. But not from us. The lawyer's response was elegant. Final. Dr. Peterson's willingness to participate in Mark's scheme had ended the moment serious legal opposition appeared. Medical professionals didn't risk their licenses for real estate agents who couldn't afford proper representation. That afternoon, Mark appeared at the door one more time. But his demeanor had changed completely. No more threats about police involvement. No more demands for medical evaluations. No more assumptions about his authority over his mother's decisions. Mom, I'm sorry. The apology came 6 months too late. Sorry didn't undo the guardianship petition. Didn't erase the threats of competency evaluations. Didn't repair the trust he had demolished with his schemes to steal her independence. I was worried about you. Worry looked exactly like greed when it involved power of attorney documents and forced home sales. When it prioritized financial control over emotional support. When it treated love like a business transaction with terms and conditions. I know about Liam now. Mark's acknowledgement felt like surrender. He had researched his new stepfather, discovered the corporate empire, calculated the impossibility of successful legal challenges against someone with unlimited resources and professional representation. This changes everything. Everything had already changed. Mark's true motives had been revealed. His willingness to destroy family relationships for financial gain had been demonstrated. His assumption that elderly people were helpless victims had been proven catastrophically wrong. I want you to be happy. The statement would have been touching if it weren't obviously strategic. Mark wanted her to forgive him. To pretend his guardianship scheme had been motivated by concern rather than greed. To restore family harmony so he could benefit from Liam's wealth instead of being excluded from it. I am happy. The words surprised her as she spoke them. Despite everything that had happened, she was happy. Protected. Defended by someone who asked nothing in return except the same protection she provided. Marriage to a stranger had given her something Mark's love never had. Freedom. Mark left without the reconciliation he had hoped for. Without the forgiveness he needed to ease his conscience. Without any assurance that he would benefit from his mother's marriage to someone worth more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. The house felt peaceful after his departure. Quiet in a way that had nothing to do with silence. Liam sat in Harold's chair reading legal documents that would protect her from future challenges. Corporate lawyers had insulated her from family members who confused caring with controlling. What happens now? Now we figure out what normal looks like. The answer was simple, complicated, perfect. Evelyn was Mrs. Vance now. Protected by legal documents and corporate resources and someone who understood that love meant partnership rather than guardianship. Who offered protection without demanding control. The marriage certificate lay on the kitchen table where Mark had left his power of attorney papers. Legal proof of the most important decision she had ever made. Evidence that sometimes desperate choices led to unexpected salvation. That protection could come from strangers who became family. Outside, Mrs. Chen waved from her garden. The neighbors had witnessed everything. Seen Mark's schemes defeated by resources they couldn't have imagined. Watched a homeless vagrant transform into corporate royalty. Learned that appearances could be deceiving in ways that changed everything. Evelyn waved back. Mrs. Vance now. Protected. Defended. Free to make decisions without permission from people who had never earned the right to control her life. The transformation was complete. The battle was over. The war was won. Night fell across Phoenix like a blanket of forgiveness. The house settled into quiet rhythms that hadn't existed since Harold's death. Liam moved through rooms with careful respect for spaces that held 40 years of memories. He didn't rearrange furniture or claim territory. Just existed peacefully in the margins of a life being rebuilt. Evelyn sat in Harold's chair. The leather still held the impression of his body. The fabric was worn smooth where his hands had rested during evening news. Liam had offered to sleep elsewhere. A hotel, another room, anywhere that would give her space to process what had happened. But the house felt safer with someone else inside. Tell me about Harold. Liam's voice was gentle, curious without being intrusive. He sat on the couch where Mark used to explain her financial limitations. Where Drive. Peterson would have conducted evaluations designed to prove her incompetence. Now it was just a place where two people talked about the past. We met at a church social. The memory felt fresh despite 40 years of distance. Harold had worn his only good suit. Navy blue with silver buttons that caught the light when he moved. He'd been nervous, shy, nothing like the confident man he became after they married. He worked construction then, built houses with his hands. Liam listened without judgment, without comparing Harold's modest achievements to corporate empires or inherited wealth. Just honored the memory of a man who had loved his wife enough to build her security one paycheck at a time. This house was our dream. Evelyn's voice caught on the word dream. Harold had drawn plans on napkins during lunch breaks, sketched room layouts while sitting at kitchen tables in apartments they couldn't wait to leave. The house represented everything they hoped to become. Security, stability, success measured in square footage and mortgage payments. He built the deck himself. Through the window, moonlight illuminated wooden planks Harold had measured twice and cut once. Each board placed with precision that came from understanding how things worked. How weight distributed, how foundations supported structures designed to last longer than the people who created them. Mark helped sometimes. The memory felt complicated now. Mark as a teenager holding boards while his father cut them. Learning skills he would never use. Values he would eventually abandon. Harold had tried to teach his son about work and patience and building things that lasted. Mark had learned different lessons. Harold worried about him. The admission felt disloyal, but truth demanded honesty about patterns that had started long before guardianship schemes and power of attorney documents. Mark had always been impatient. Always looking for shortcuts, always calculating value in terms of immediate benefit rather than long-term security. Young people see money differently. Liam's observation was gentle, non-judgmental. He understood generational differences without condemning either perspective. But his words couldn't erase the pain of watching love transform into opportunity. Of seeing Harold's teachings rejected in favor of easier philosophies. Mark borrowed money for business school. The statement opened old wounds that had never properly healed. $20,000 from their retirement savings. Money Harold had earned through overtime and careful budgeting and dreams deferred. Mark had promised to pay it back. Had meant to pay it back. Had forgotten about it when other opportunities appeared. The business degree didn't work out. Real estate had been Mark's third career choice. After business consulting failed. After financial planning proved too demanding. After each setback taught him that success required more effort than he was willing to invest. Real estate offered commissions without capital investment. Success without substance. Harold never asked for the money back. The decision had been Harold's. Evelyn had wanted to demand repayment. To insist on consequences for broken promises. But Harold believed in forgiveness. In giving people chances to prove they could change. In loving unconditionally even when love wasn't returned. Maybe that was a mistake. The words felt like betrayal. Harold's kindness criticized by someone who had benefited from it for 40 years. But enabling someone to avoid consequences wasn't kindness. It was permission to continue destructive patterns. Harold's forgiveness had taught Mark that promises were optional. People learn what we teach them. Liam's voice carried understanding of mistakes made from love rather than wisdom. Good intentions that created bad outcomes. Kindness that enabled cruelty. Protection that prevented growth. The most destructive human behaviors often grew from the most positive emotions. Harold got sick 3 years ago. The transition felt abrupt, but illness had a way of revealing character that healthy times kept hidden. Cancer had tested everything Harold believed about fairness and justice and the rewards that came from living responsibly. The disease didn't care about good intentions or financial planning. Mark started visiting more often. The increased attention had felt like blessing at first. A son finally appreciating his father. Spending time together before it was too late. Making memories that would comfort after death arrived. Evelyn had been grateful for Mark's sudden interest in family relationships. He always brought papers, insurance forms, estate planning documents, financial statements that needed signatures. Mark's visits always included business. Always addressed practical concerns about asset management and inheritance planning. Always focused on details Harold was too sick to evaluate carefully. I should have paid more attention. The regret tasted bitter. Evelyn had been focused on Harold's medical care. On managing his pain and maintaining his dignity and pretending they had more time than cancer would allow. Mark's financial management had seemed helpful. Necessary. Someone had to handle details Harold couldn't manage alone. He changed the beneficiaries. The discovery had come after Harold's funeral. Life insurance policies that should have provided security were redirected to pay Mark's debts. Investment accounts Harold had built through decades of careful saving were emptied to fund Mark's latest business ventures. The financial foundation of their marriage had been stolen while Harold was dying. Harold never knew. The confession felt like absolution and condemnation simultaneously. Harold had died believing his family was protected. That his life's work would provide security for the woman he loved. That his son understood responsibility and would honor promises made to parents who had sacrificed everything for his benefit. Mark said it was temporary. Emergency loans against inheritance that would be repaid immediately. Business opportunities that would multiply Harold's modest investments. Strategic financial management that would benefit everyone involved. Mark had used Harold's weakness to steal his strength. His dying father's trust to finance his own ambitions. The money was gone. Simple statement. Devastating reality. 40 years of careful saving reduced to nothing. Harold's pension cut in half by his death. Social security insufficient to cover expenses that hadn't decreased. Evelyn had discovered poverty slowly. One unpaid bill at a time. One rationed prescription at a time. I couldn't tell anyone. Shame had kept her silent. Pride had prevented her from admitting that her own son had stolen her security while she held her husband's hand in hospital rooms that smelled of disinfectant and approaching death. Family business was private business. Even when family business destroyed families. Mark said he was protecting me. The same language he used now. Protection disguised as theft. Concern expressed through control. Love demonstrated by removing her ability to make independent decisions. Mark's philosophy was consistent. He knew better than everyone else what was best for them. That's when the bills started coming. Past due notices. Coverage denials. Final warnings. The mathematics of poverty applied to someone who had never expected to be poor. Fixed income that couldn't accommodate variable expenses. Medical costs that increased as age-related problems accumulated. Harold would have been heartbroken. The truth was Harold would have been furious. Would have confronted Mark immediately. Would have demanded restitution and accountability and changes in behavior that respected other people's rights. Harold's kindness had limits. His forgiveness required repentance. He worked so hard. 40 years of construction work. Houses built one nail at a time. Overtime hours that bought security one paycheck at a time. Delayed gratification that allowed investments to grow slowly but reliably. Harold had built their life the same way he built houses. Carefully, permanently, with foundations designed to last. Mark never understood. The observation felt cruel but accurate. Mark had inherited the results without understanding the process. Had received benefits without appreciating sacrifice. Had assumed wealth was permanent rather than fragile. That money would always exist because it always had existed. Maybe I failed too. The admission hurt more than Mark's betrayal. Parenting was supposed to teach values along with providing advantages. Character development alongside opportunity creation. Evelyn had given Mark everything except consequences. Love without limits. Forgiveness without accountability. You loved him. Liam's words offered grace she couldn't give herself. But love wasn't enough. Love without boundaries became permission. Love without expectations became enabling. Love that prevented learning became cruelty disguised as kindness. Harold believed people could change. The statement was true. Harold had maintained faith in human potential even when evidence suggested otherwise. Had continued believing in Mark's basic goodness even after disappointments accumulated. Had chosen hope over experience because hope felt more loving than wisdom. Some people need help changing. Liam's observation carried weight beyond its brevity. Mark had never faced consequences serious enough to motivate transformation. Had never encountered opposition strong enough to force reflection. Had never lost enough to understand what others sacrificed for his benefit. The lawyers will help? The lawyers will ensure he can't hurt you again. The distinction was important. Legal protection wasn't the same as relationship repair. Corporate resources could prevent future theft but couldn't restore trust. Money could buy security but couldn't purchase love that hadn't been earned through changed behavior. What about forgiveness? Forgiveness doesn't require vulnerability. Liam's wisdom felt earned rather than theoretical. He had probably faced similar choices with his own children. Similar decisions about love and money and the intersection where both were tested. Forgiveness was possible, but it didn't require creating new opportunities for betrayal. Harold would have wanted me to forgive. Harold would have wanted you to be safe. The answer revealed understanding of marriages that lasted long enough to accumulate deep knowledge about each other's true priorities. Harold's kindness was real, but his protectiveness was stronger. He would have chosen Evelyn's security over Mark's feelings without hesitation. The house settled around them with creaks that had become familiar over 40 years. Sounds Harold had heard every night. Noises that had comforted him through illness and worry and the gradual acceptance of mortality. Now they comforted someone else. Someone who understood what home meant to people who had built it themselves. Thank you. The words felt inadequate. Gratitude couldn't capture the magnitude of protection Liam provided. Legal security, financial stability, the restoration of dignity that came from being defended rather than dismissed. Partnership instead of guardianship. Thank you for trusting me. The response revealed mutual benefit. Liam needed protection from his own family. Needed someone who understood that age didn't eliminate the right to make independent decisions. Needed partnership that respected rather than controlled. Marriage had saved them both. Outside, Phoenix settled into the quiet hours when honest people slept and troubled people faced the consequences of choices they couldn't undo. Mark was probably awake, calculating new strategies, planning different approaches, trying to repair damage that couldn't be fixed with apologies or promises. But inside Harold's house, peace had returned. Temporary perhaps, fragile certainly, but real enough to allow sleep without fear. Protection that felt earned rather than purchased. Safety that came from partnership rather than power. The marriage certificate lay on Harold's desk. Legal proof of decisions made in desperation that led to unexpected salvation. Evidence that sometimes the craziest choices were the wisest choices. That protection could come from strangers who understood what family members refused to acknowledge. Dignity was worth more than money. Independence was worth more than security. Freedom was worth more than love that demanded surrender as proof of gratitude. Harold would have understood. Harold would have approved. Harold would have been proud that his wife chose strength over submission even when strength required courage she didn't know she possessed. The past was past. The future was protected. The present was peaceful. That was enough. Morning arrived with the sound of phones ringing. Not Evelyn's phone. Liam's. Multiple devices buzzing with urgency that penetrated the peaceful quiet they had constructed around themselves. Corporate responsibility couldn't be delayed indefinitely. Decisions waited that affected more people than just the two of them. Liam answered the calls with quiet efficiency. His voice carried authority that had been hidden beneath homeless disguises and gambling facades. CEO language emerged naturally. Terms like market analysis, and asset allocation, and fiduciary responsibility flowed like his native tongue returning after forced exile. We need to handle some business. The statement felt ominous. Business meant lawyers and contracts and complications that could destroy the simple protection their marriage provided. Evelyn had been Mrs. Vance for 4 days, long enough to feel safe but not long enough to trust that safety was permanent. Your children? Among other problems, Liam's expression revealed the complexity of wealth that came with inherited responsibilities. Corporate boards that demanded explanations. Shareholders who deserved answers. Children who had declared him missing while attempting to seize assets he had spent decades building. They think you're dead? They think I'm incompetent. The parallel was exact. Liam's children had used his age to challenge his decision-making capacity. Had filed petitions claiming he needed protection from his own choices. Had attempted legal guardianship disguised as loving concern. The same strategies Mark had employed, but with billions instead of thousands at stake. How long were you hiding? 6 months. The timeline matched her widowhood almost exactly. Liam had been conducting his own experiment in independence while she struggled with bills she couldn't pay. Both testing whether people their age could disappear from children who treated them like property rather than parents. It's time to go back. The words carried finality that made her stomach tighten. Going back meant leaving Phoenix. Leaving Harold's house. Leaving the life she had spent 40 years building for corporate headquarters, where she would be the billionaire's wife instead of Harold's widow. Where? Seattle first. Then New York. Then wherever the lawyers decide we need to be. The itinerary felt like a prison sentence. Cities where she knew no one. Corporate environments where her presence would be analyzed and evaluated. Legal proceedings where her marriage would be examined for authenticity and motivation. I don't know anything about business. You don't need to know business. You need to know me. Liam's response was reassuring and terrifying simultaneously. Corporate wives were expected to perform roles she had never learned. Social functions, charitable boards, public appearances that would be scrutinized by people who understood inherited wealth better than earned security. What about Mark? What about him? The question revealed how completely their situation had changed. Mark's guardianship schemes were irrelevant now. His threats about competency evaluations were meaningless when opposed by resources that dwarfed his ambitions. He had become a minor inconvenience rather than an existential threat. He's still my son. He's still dangerous. Liam's warning was gentle but firm. Mark's patterns wouldn't change because his schemes had been defeated. He would adapt, find new approaches, develop different strategies for extracting value from family relationships that had become corporate opportunities. The house? The house will be protected. Professional property management would maintain Harold's garden. Corporate security would prevent unauthorized access. Legal documents would ensure Mark couldn't force sales or manipulate titles. But protection wasn't the same as presence. Someone else would care for spaces where she had lived and loved and learned. I need time to pack. We need time to plan. The distinction was important. Packing implied temporary absence. Planning suggested permanent transformation. Evelyn was leaving Phoenix as Harold's widow. She would return as Liam's wife. The difference was more than geographical. That afternoon, lawyers arrived with documents that required signatures and explanations that demanded understanding. Corporate restructuring to accommodate marriage. Asset protection to prevent family challenges. Legal frameworks that would insulate them from children who confused inheritance with entitlement. Mrs. Vance will need her own representation. The statement surprised her. Why would she need lawyers to protect her from lawyers who were supposed to protect her? But corporate marriages involved conflicts of interest that didn't exist in relationships between people with similar resources. Independent counsel ensures your interests are protected. The lawyer who spoke was a woman about her age. Professional but warm. Someone who understood that becoming wealthy overnight was more terrifying than liberating. Who recognized that protection could feel like imprisonment if not carefully structured. You have rights. The statement was simple, revolutionary. For 6 months, Evelyn had been treated like someone whose rights were conditional. Subject to evaluation. Dependent on approval from people who claimed authority over her decisions. Now she had rights that couldn't be challenged or evaluated or taken away without her consent. Prenuptial agreements are standard. Posthumous agreements are more important. Liam's correction revealed thinking beyond current convenience. If he died before her, she would inherit everything. Become responsible for assets that generated more income in a day than Harold had earned in a year. Widowhood would be different the second time. Do you want that responsibility? The question was honest. Terrifying. Liberating. Want wasn't the right word. Nobody wanted responsibility for billions of dollars and thousands of employees and corporate decisions that affected communities across multiple countries. But desire wasn't the only criterion for accepting necessary obligations. What would happen to the company? It would be sold, dismantled, destroyed by people who never understood how to build anything. Liam's voice carried sadness beyond personal loss. The company represented decades of work by thousands of people. Jobs and careers and communities that depended on leadership that understood long-term thinking rather than short-term profits. Like Mark would do to Harold's house. Exactly like that. The comparison was perfect. Mark would sell Harold's house to fund lifestyle choices that produced nothing of lasting value. Liam's children would liquidate his company for inheritance money they would spend faster than it could be replaced. Both scenarios involved destruction disguised as practical financial management. I accept. The words came out stronger than she felt. But acceptance wasn't about confidence. It was about responsibility to people she would never meet who depended on decisions she was learning to make. Workers who needed jobs. Communities that needed employers. Values that needed protection from people who measured worth only in immediate financial terms. The documents were signed with pens that cost more than her monthly grocery budget. Legal language that transformed her from poverty to wealth faster than she could mentally process. Bank accounts appeared with balances that included numbers she had never counted. Credit cards arrived with limits that exceeded Mark's annual income. This feels surreal. Wealth is always surreal at first. Liam's observation came from experience she was just beginning to acquire. Money changed everything and nothing simultaneously. She was still Harold's widow. Still someone who rationed prescription medication and recycled dishwater to maintain a garden. But now she was also someone who could buy pharmaceutical companies if she chose. What about my pills? What about them? The question revealed how completely her situation had changed. Medicare denials were irrelevant when cash payment was simpler than insurance negotiation. Pharmacy costs that had forced rationing were now rounding errors in monthly budgets that included numbers she couldn't comprehend. I need to call Drive. Peterson. Doctor. Peterson needs to call you. The power dynamic had reversed completely. Medical professionals who had participated in Mark's competency schemes would now compete for access to someone whose charitable foundation could fund their research projects. Respect would be automatic rather than earned. Evening brought phone calls from Mark. Multiple attempts to reach her before they left Phoenix. Messages that evolved from apology to desperation to anger to threats about family loyalty and filial obligations. His voice revealed someone who had discovered that bridges burned in greed couldn't be rebuilt with apologies. Mom, we need to talk before you make any permanent decisions. Permanent was a relative term. Mark's guardianship petition would have been permanent. His power of attorney documents would have been permanent. His control over her assets and housing and medical care would have been permanent. Marriage to someone who respected her autonomy was temporary until she chose otherwise. I've made mistakes. I admit that. Admission wasn't accountability. Acknowledgement wasn't apology. Recognition wasn't repentance. Mark could admit mistakes while maintaining his belief that those mistakes were justified by circumstances beyond his control. That financial pressure excused ethical violations. That good intentions justified destructive methods. But you're my mother. The statement revealed his fundamental misunderstanding. Being someone's mother didn't eliminate her rights as an individual human being. Didn't require accepting abuse disguised as concern. Didn't obligate her to prioritize his financial needs over her own security. I love you. Love was behavior, not feeling. Love was respect, not control. Love was protection, not exploitation. Mark's love had been possessive rather than supportive. Demanding rather than giving. Conditional on compliance rather than unconditional despite disagreement. Don't let money destroy our family. The accusation was backwards. Mark had attempted to destroy their family for money. Had filed guardianship petitions for house equity. Had collaborated with medical professionals to prove incompetence that would justify asset seizure. Money hadn't destroyed their family. Greed had destroyed their family. Liam listened to the messages without comment. He understood family dynamics corrupted by financial desperation. Children who felt entitled to inheritance before parents died. Sons and daughters who measured love in terms of access to assets rather than quality of relationships. He'll keep trying. Let him try. The confidence in Liam's voice was earned rather than assumed. Corporate security would prevent physical harassment. Legal representation would handle attempts at financial manipulation. Resources would provide protection that allowed healing rather than requiring constant vigilance. Pack what matters. The instruction was simple, complicated. What mattered after 68 years of life? Harold's coffee mug, wedding photos, the garden tools he had used to build spaces where vegetables grew and memories accumulated. Things that had value beyond monetary measurement. Everything else can be replaced. True but difficult. Harold's chair couldn't be replaced. The kitchen table where they had planned their life couldn't be duplicated. The bedroom where they had loved and argued and forgiven and grown old together was unique in ways that money couldn't reproduce. But staying meant vulnerability. Staying meant exposure to Mark's continuing schemes. Staying meant isolation in a house that had become a target rather than a sanctuary. Staying meant choosing the past over the future. Memory over possibility. Fear over hope. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning. 24 hours to say goodbye to 40 years of life. To pack memories that fit in suitcases. To leave spaces where Harold's presence still felt real for corporate environments where his existence would become biographical information shared at social functions. I'm scared. Fear is reasonable. Liam's honesty was comforting. He wasn't minimizing her concerns or pretending transformation was easy. Wealth brought responsibilities she had never imagined. Social expectations she didn't understand. Public scrutiny that would analyze her background and motivations and right to access resources she hadn't earned. Will you help me? We'll help each other. The promise was mutual. Partnership rather than protection. Collaboration rather than control. Marriage based on respect rather than romance. Shared challenges rather than individual struggles. They would face corporate boardrooms and family lawyers and suspicious children together. That night, Evelyn walked through Harold's house one more time. Touched surfaces he had built with his own hands. Inhaled air that still held traces of his presence. Said goodbye to spaces where their life together had unfolded one day at a time over 40 years of shared history. The garden looked peaceful in moonlight. Tomato plants Harold had helped her select still produced vegetables that sustained her through Mark's financial abuse. Soil he had enriched with compost and care continued supporting life after his death. Some things endured beyond the people who created them. He would approve. Liam's voice was gentle, respectful of grief that was real despite new opportunities. Harold would have wanted her protected. Would have approved of any solution that preserved her dignity and independence. Would have understood that survival sometimes required abandoning familiar security for unknown possibilities. He would worry. He would trust your judgment. The statement was true. Harold had believed in her decision-making capacity even when she doubted herself. Had supported her choices even when he disagreed with them. Had loved her enough to respect her autonomy rather than trying to control her behavior for her own good. I'll miss this place. You'll visit. The promise was real but different. Visiting was temporary. Guest status rather than ownership. The house would be maintained but not inhabited. Protected but not lived in. Preserved but not continued. Museum status rather than home reality. Mourning brought cars that cost more than the house. Professional drivers who handled luggage with respect for possessions that mattered more than their values suggested. Corporate efficiency that transformed departure from traumatic to smooth. Money making everything easier except the emotions that money couldn't purchase. Mrs. Chen waved goodbye from her garden. Other neighbors watched from windows. The woman who had struggled with bills for 6 months was leaving as someone whose resources could buy their entire neighborhood. Transformation that felt surreal to witness even from the inside. Phoenix disappeared behind them like a chapter ending. Mile markers measured distance from the life she had known toward circumstances she couldn't predict. But Liam sat beside her in luxury that felt earned rather than guilty. Protection she had chosen rather than accepted. Partnership she had negotiated rather than inherited. What comes next? We find out who we are when we're not afraid. The answer was perfect. Terrifying. Liberating. For 6 months, fear had governed every decision. Fear of bills she couldn't pay. Fear of medicine she couldn't afford. Fear of children who treated her like property. Fear of systems that measured worth in terms of compliance rather than contribution. Now fear was optional. Resources provided choices. Legal protection offered security. Partnership supplied strength. The future was uncertain but not threatening. Unknown but not dangerous. Different but not worse. Thank you. Thank you for trusting me. The exchange was honest, mutual, based on understanding that some risks were worth taking when alternatives were unacceptable. That protection could come from unexpected sources. That partnership could develop between people who shared challenges rather than histories. The marriage certificate lay in her purse. Legal proof of decisions made in desperation that led to salvation. Evidence that sometimes the craziest choices were the wisest choices. That love could be based on respect rather than romance. On partnership rather than passion. On choice rather than chance. Behind them, Mark would discover an empty house and corporate lawyers and security systems that protected assets he could no longer threaten. His schemes had created consequences he couldn't control. His greed had generated opposition he couldn't defeat. His mother had escaped before he could complete the theft he had planned for months. Ahead lay challenges she couldn't predict but no longer faced alone. Responsibilities she hadn't sought but had accepted. Opportunities she hadn't earned but would try to deserve. Life as Mrs. Vance instead of Harold's widow. Protection instead of vulnerability. Partnership instead of isolation. Freedom instead of fear. The transformation was complete. The escape was successful. The future was protected. That was enough. Seattle emerged from morning fog like a city built from corporate dreams and coffee-fueled ambitions. The skyline stretched toward clouds that pressed down like gray blankets. Everything felt larger than Phoenix. More complex. More demanding of people who navigated environments designed for success measured in quarterly reports rather than quarterly vegetables. The hotel occupied 30 floors of glass and steel that reflected other buildings full of people. Making decisions that affected strangers they would never meet. Liam's suite overlooked Elliott Bay. Water that connected Seattle to places where cargo ships carried products. Manufactured in factories owned by companies controlled by people like her new husband. The board meeting is tomorrow. Liam's statement carried weight beyond its brevity. 6 months of corporate leadership decisions had accumulated while he conducted experiments in independence. Shareholders deserved explanations. Employees needed reassurance. Children required legal confrontation that would determine control over assets they assumed belonged to them. Will I need to attend? You'll need to be prepared to attend. The distinction was important. Corporate wives were strategic assets deployed when circumstances required emotional credibility that male executives couldn't provide. Evelyn would be introduced as someone who humanized billionaire decision-making, who proved that wealth hadn't eliminated humanity. What do I say? You tell the truth. Simple advice. Impossible execution. The truth was that she had married a stranger to avoid guardianship proceedings initiated by her son who wanted to steal her house. That desperation had led to salvation she didn't understand or deserve. That she was still learning how to be wealthy after 68 years of modest means. Corporate lawyers arrived with briefing materials designed to educate someone who needed crash courses in fiduciary responsibility. And shareholder relations and media management. Legal concepts that hadn't existed in her vocabulary until marriage transformed her from poverty to power faster than education could accommodate. Hostile takeover attempts began 3 months ago. The lawyer who spoke was young enough to be her grandson. But his voice carried authority earned through victories in corporate wars she couldn't comprehend. Liam's children had moved beyond guardianship petitions to direct asset seizure. Legal sophistication beyond Mark's capabilities. They claim abandonment of duties. Abandonment suggested Liam had fled responsibility rather than testing whether people his age could maintain independence without family permission. Corporate law apparently didn't recognize the right to disappear when children treated parents like assets rather than human beings. Stock prices have declined. Market uncertainty created by leadership questions. Investor concerns about succession planning. Competitor exploitation of temporary vulnerability. Liam's experiment in freedom had generated real consequences for people who depended on stable corporate management. The Seattle Times wants interviews. Media attention meant public scrutiny of their marriage. Questions about motivations and authenticity and whether elderly romance could be distinguished from financial opportunism. Reporters would analyze their relationship for evidence of exploitation disguised as affection. What do we tell them? We tell them the truth. Liam's answer was consistent, honest, terrifying. The truth was complicated enough to be misunderstood by people who specialized in reducing complex situations to simple narratives that fit newspaper deadlines and television sound bites. The truth about what? About families who betray trust for financial gain. The statement reframed their situation from personal drama to social commentary. Elder abuse wasn't unique to them. Children who exploited parents weren't uncommon. Systems that failed vulnerable adults weren't exceptions. Their story was representative rather than isolated. About systems that measure competence in compliance. Legal structures that assumed age eliminated autonomy. Medical professionals who diagnosed independence as dementia. Courts that treated self-determination as evidence of mental illness. Guardianship laws that protected assets rather than people. About marriage as legal protection rather than romantic fantasy. Partnership based on mutual respect rather than physical attraction. Security through legal alliance rather than emotional dependence. Love demonstrated through defense rather than sentiment. Marriage that served practical purposes while providing genuine companionship. The media will be skeptical. Let them be skeptical. Liam's confidence was earned through decades of corporate leadership that required dealing with hostile analysis from people who didn't understand the decisions they criticized. Skepticism was manageable. Truth was defensible. Their marriage could withstand scrutiny because it was based on honest mutual benefit rather than deception. That afternoon, Evelyn called Drive Peterson. The conversation was different now. Respectful rather than condescending. Concerned about her welfare rather than her competence. Money had transformed medical relationships faster than education could modify professional attitudes. Mrs. Harper. I mean, Mrs. Vance. The name correction revealed how completely her status had changed. Mrs. Harper had been someone whose son's concerns deserved medical consideration. Mrs. Vance was someone whose charitable foundation could fund hospital expansions and research programs. I want to apologize for my participation in the situation with Mark. Apology without accountability. Recognition without repentance. Dr. Peterson acknowledged involvement while maintaining professional distance from ethical violations he had willingly committed. Medical objectivity disguised as personal concern. Mark was very convincing about his mother's declining capabilities. Convincing wasn't the same as truthful. Mark had manipulated medical opinions to support legal strategies that served his financial interests. Dr. Peterson had allowed professional judgment to be influenced by family pressure rather than clinical evidence. I should have insisted on independent evaluation. Should have was meaningless without commitment to different future behavior. Dr. Peterson was apologizing because wealthy patients deserved better treatment than poor patients. Because corporate foundations provided opportunities that Medicare reimbursements couldn't match. I hope you'll consider returning as a patient. The invitation was strategic rather than medical. Dr. Peterson wanted access to someone whose resources could benefit his practice. Professional relationship with charitable implications. Medical care that included development opportunities. I'll consider it. Consideration was diplomatic rather than commitment. Evelyn needed medical care from professionals who respected her autonomy. Who provided health care rather than enabling family financial schemes. Who treated her as a patient rather than a potential donor. Evening brought phone calls from Mark. Desperate attempts to reach her before corporate lawyers made contact impossible. His voice revealed someone who had discovered that bridges burned in greed couldn't be rebuilt with apologies when the targeted assets exceeded local real estate commissions. Mom, I know you're in Seattle. Knowledge suggested research. Investigation. Possible surveillance of someone whose movements were now protected by corporate security but monitored by children who refused to accept defeat. Mark was escalating rather than retreating. I'm flying up tomorrow. We need to meet. Need was Mark's requirement, not hers. He needed access that would allow new schemes to replace failed guardianship strategies. He needed proximity that would enable different approaches to asset extraction. He needed reconciliation that would restore his position as heir rather than threat. I've hired lawyers. The statement was meant to intimidate. Mark assumed legal representation would impress someone who couldn't afford attorneys. But corporate legal resources dwarfed anything Mark could purchase. His lawyers would be overwhelmed faster than his guardianship petition had been withdrawn. This is about family, not money. The distinction was false. Mark's definition of family required financial access. His concept of love demanded control over assets. His understanding of relationship included authority over decisions that affected inheritance potential. Family was money when measured in Mark's emotional vocabulary. I'm your son. Biological relationship didn't confer rights to exploitation. Being someone's child didn't eliminate their autonomy. Family status didn't justify financial abuse. Mark was her son, but he was also someone who had tried to steal her independence for house equity. Liam listened to the messages without comment. He understood family dynamics corrupted by wealth disparities. Children who felt entitled to inheritance before parents died. Sons and daughters who measured affection in terms of access to assets rather than quality of relationships. He'll escalate. Let him. Corporate security could handle physical harassment. Legal representation could address attempted manipulation. Resources provided protection that allowed healing rather than requiring constant vigilance against family members who had declared emotional war. What if he threatens to expose our marriage? Our marriage doesn't need protection from exposure. Truth was defensible in ways that deception couldn't be. Their relationship was honest about its motivations and mutual benefits. Marriage for protection was legal and ethical. When protection was legitimately needed from family members who had demonstrated willingness to abuse legal systems. The next morning brought corporate boardrooms that intimidated through architectural design intended to remind visitors of their relative insignificance. Conference tables that seated 20 people making decisions that affected thousands. Windows that looked down on cities full of people whose lives were influenced by quarterly reports and earnings projections. Mrs. Vance will be joining the board. Liam's announcement surprised everyone, including her. Board membership meant responsibility for decisions she didn't understand about industries she couldn't navigate. Corporate governance involving markets and regulations and competitive strategies that required expertise she didn't possess. I don't know anything about business. You know about people. The distinction was important. Corporate decisions ultimately affected human beings. Workers who needed jobs. Communities that required employers. Customers who deserved products that enhanced rather than exploited their circumstances. Business was about people even when mathematics dominated discussions. The fiduciary responsibility. The fiduciary responsibility is to serve shareholders by serving humanity. Liam's definition reframed corporate obligations in terms she could understand. Profit generation through ethical behavior. Wealth creation through value provision. Success measured by contribution rather than extraction. Business philosophy that aligned with values Harold had taught through example. The board meeting revealed power dynamics that existed between people who controlled resources that shaped civilization. Members who represented pension funds and university endowments and charitable foundations. Individuals whose decisions affected strangers they would never meet but whose welfare depended on responsible leadership. Mr. Vance's absence created uncertainty. Uncertainty was corporate language for panic. Leadership questions that affected stock prices. Succession concerns that influenced investor confidence. Competitive vulnerabilities that rivals exploited when management attention was diverted by family conflicts. Hostile takeover attempts increased during the leadership gap. Predatory corporations had moved quickly to exploit perceived weakness. Attempted asset seizure by companies that specialized in dismantling successful businesses for short-term profits. Vulture capitalism that destroyed jobs and communities for quarterly bonuses. The Seattle facility employs 12,000 people. Employment that supported families and communities. Paychecks that funded mortgages and education and medical care for workers who depended on stable corporate leadership. Responsibility that extended beyond shareholder returns to human welfare. Hostile acquisition would result in facility closure. Plant shutdown that would devastate local economy. Job losses that would ripple through communities. Corporate destruction disguised as efficiency improvement. Financial engineering that prioritized quarterly profits over long-term sustainability. We prevented the takeover. Success that preserved employment and community stability. Defense against predatory capitalism that measured worth only in immediate financial terms. Corporate responsibility that protected stakeholders rather than exploiting them for shareholder benefit. Mrs. Vance's presence confirms succession planning. Her marriage provided stability that markets required for confidence. Proof that leadership transition would maintain values rather than changing fundamental corporate philosophy. Assurance that long-term thinking would continue guiding decisions that affected thousands of people. The meeting continued for 3 hours. Technical discussions about market analysis and competitive positioning and regulatory compliance. Business concepts that overwhelmed someone whose previous corporate experience involved parent-teacher conferences and PTA fundraising events. But underneath financial terminology were human concerns she understood completely. People who needed jobs. Communities that required responsible employers. Workers who deserved leadership that balanced profit with ethics. Values that transcended quarterly reports to address long-term welfare of everyone affected by corporate decisions. The vote is unanimous. Board membership confirmed despite her lack of business education. Responsibility accepted based on character rather than credentials. Trust extended because ethical judgment was more valuable than technical expertise. Authority granted because good people made better decisions than smart people who lacked moral foundations. Afternoon brought media interviews that analyzed their marriage for evidence of exploitation disguised as romance. Reporters who specialized in reducing complex situations to simple narratives that fit television sound bites and newspaper headlines. Mrs. Vance, how did you meet your husband? At a slot machine in Las Vegas. Honesty that surprised journalists who expected diplomatic answers designed to obscure uncomfortable truths. Reality that was more interesting than manufactured romance. Truth that was defensible because it was authentic rather than strategic. Isn't the age difference concerning? He's 4 years older than me. Fact that contradicted assumptions about young women marrying elderly billionaires for inheritance opportunities. Age similarity that suggested companionship rather than gold digging. Partnership between peers rather than exploitation of vulnerability. What attracted you to each other? We were both hiding from our children. Answer that reframed the narrative from romantic fantasy to social commentary. Elder abuse by family members who confused caring with controlling. Systemic problems that affected multiple families rather than isolated incidents. Your son filed guardianship proceedings? My son tried to steal my house. Direct language that described legal manipulation accurately. Financial abuse disguised as concern. Family betrayal that justified legal protection through marriage to someone who offered partnership rather than control. Mr. Vance, why were you hiding from your children? They declared me incompetent to seize corporate assets. Parallel experience that revealed common patterns in family financial abuse. Adult children who felt entitled to inheritance before parents died. Legal systems that enabled exploitation rather than protection. How did marriage solve these problems? Marriage provided legal protection from family members who had demonstrated willingness to abuse guardianship laws for financial gain. Explanation that educated viewers about systemic problems affecting elderly Americans. Legal remedies available to people who understood their rights. Options that existed beyond compliance with family demands disguised as concern. The interviews lasted 2 hours. Questions that revealed journalist skepticism about elderly romance. Assumptions about vulnerability and exploitation that didn't match the reality of partnership between equals who shared similar challenges and values. But truth was consistent, defensible, verifiable through legal documents and medical records and financial statements that proved competence rather than impairment. Marriage that served mutual benefit rather than one-sided exploitation. Evening brought celebration dinner that felt earned rather than inherited. Corporate victory that preserved jobs and communities. Legal success that protected assets from predatory acquisition. Personal triumph that demonstrated elderly independence despite family opposition. The stock price recovered. Market confidence restored through demonstrated leadership stability. Investor certainty about succession planning. Corporate strength that discouraged further hostile takeover attempts. Economic security for thousands of employees whose welfare depended on responsible management. Mark called the hotel. Persistence that revealed desperation rather than determination. Mark's inability to accept defeat. His continued belief that family status conferred rights to financial access. Escalation that would require corporate security intervention. He's demanding a meeting. Demands from someone who had forfeited the right to make demands. Requirements from a son who had chosen financial exploitation over family relationship. Expectations from someone who measured love in terms of asset access. What do we tell him? We tell him the truth. Consistency that had guided every response to media and legal and family challenges. Honesty that was defensible because their relationship was authentic. Truth that was sustainable because it was based on mutual respect rather than manufactured romance. The truth about what we've accomplished here. Corporate responsibility that balanced profit with ethics. Board membership that prioritized human welfare alongside shareholder returns. Marriage that provided protection while preserving autonomy. Success that benefited communities rather than exploiting them. The truth about what family means. Family was behavior, not biology. Family was respect, not control. Family was protection, not exploitation. Mark had abandoned family values when he chose financial gain over emotional connection. The truth about what love requires. Love required respect for autonomy. Love demanded support without control. Love meant protection rather than possession. Mark's love had been conditional on compliance rather than unconditional despite disagreement. The Seattle skyline sparkled with lights from buildings where people worked and lived and made decisions that shaped their communities. Corporate headquarters that employed thousands. Residential towers that housed families. Business districts that generated prosperity through ethical behavior rather than exploitative practices. Tomorrow we go to New York. Additional corporate responsibilities that couldn't be delayed indefinitely. Shareholder meetings that required personal attention. Legal proceedings that would determine long-term control over assets that affected thousands of people. Will Mark follow us? Probably. Persistence that had become harassment. Determination that had become stalking. Family concern that had become financial obsession. Mark's inability to accept that bridges burned in greed couldn't be rebuilt through geographic persistence. Corporate security will handle it. Professional protection that allowed focus on legitimate responsibilities rather than family dysfunction. Resources that provided safety without requiring constant vigilance. Protection that was earned rather than inherited. What happens after New York? We go home. Home to Phoenix. Home to Harold's house. Home to the garden where vegetables grew and memories accumulated. Home to spaces that mattered more than corporate headquarters or hotel suites or cities full of strangers. Home to build something new. Marriage that balanced protection with partnership. Wealth that served communities rather than exploiting them. Life that honored the past while embracing possibilities Harold would have wanted for her. The corporate battles were won. The family conflicts were resolved. The legal protections were established. Mark's schemes had generated consequences that would follow him for years. His mother had escaped before he could complete the financial theft he had planned for months. Success measured in jobs preserved and communities protected and elderly independence demonstrated despite family opposition. Victory that proved age didn't eliminate autonomy. Protection that came through partnership rather than guardianship. Freedom that was chosen rather than granted. The transformation was complete. The escape was successful. The future was protected. Justice had been served through corporate resources applied to family dysfunction. Love had been redefined as respect rather than control. Family had been rebuilt on choice rather than obligation. That was enough. 2 months later, Phoenix welcomed them back with desert heat that felt like an embrace from an old friend. The same sun that had pressed down during her darkest moments now warmed spaces that had been reclaimed and protected. Harold's house stood exactly as they had left it, but everything else had changed in ways that money could make possible. The garden bloomed with vegetables that grew in soil enriched by professional care and unlimited resources. Tomato plants that Harold had helped her select now produced abundance rather than subsistence. The same seeds, the same earth, but nourished by security that eliminated the mathematics of rationed water and recycled dishwater. Mrs. Chen waved from her porch, the same friendly gesture but with new respect that came from understanding. The neighbor who had watched Mark's schemes unfold now witnessed their defeat. The woman who had seen elderly vulnerability now observed elderly empowerment. Power that had been earned rather than inherited. The house feels different. Liam's observation was accurate. The rooms that had echoed with loneliness now hummed with purpose. Spaces that had felt like prisons during Mark's financial Siege had been transformed into headquarters for activities that gave meaning to wealth beyond accumulation. The kitchen table where she had rationed pills and counted bills now held plans for the Harper Foundation. Charitable work that would help other elderly Americans navigate systems designed to exploit rather than protect them. Legal aid for seniors facing guardianship abuse. Educational programs that taught families how love differed from control. Harold would be proud. The statement felt true in ways that justified everything that had happened since his death. Harold had worked 40 years to build security for the woman he loved. His pension had been stolen, but his values had been preserved. His house had been threatened, but his legacy had been protected through transformation he could never have imagined. Dr. Peterson called that morning, requesting an appointment that would restore their professional relationship. But the dynamic had shifted permanently. Evelyn was no longer a patient who needed to prove competence. She was a foundation director who would evaluate whether his practice deserved charitable support. Mrs. Vance, I want to discuss the senior care initiatives we've been developing. Senior care initiatives that hadn't existed when she needed them. Programs that emerged after wealthy patients made physicians consider their responsibilities beyond Medicare reimbursement. Medical attention that followed money rather than need. I'm interested in competency evaluation protocols. Interest in systems that could distinguish between normal aging and actual impairment. Assessment procedures that couldn't be manipulated by family members with financial motivations. Medical ethics that protected patients from relatives who confused inheritance timing with healthcare decisions. We're reviewing our guardianship consultation policies. Policy review that would prevent future collaboration with children seeking medical justification for financial exploitation. Professional standards that prioritized patient autonomy over family convenience. Ethics that couldn't be purchased by sons who needed doctor cooperation for guardianship schemes. I'd like to establish assessment standards that protect patient rights. Protection that Evelyn hadn't received when she needed it most. Standards that would prevent other elderly Americans from facing competency challenges based on family financial pressure rather than clinical evidence. Medical advocacy that defended patients from relatives who treated them like assets. The Harper Foundation would be interested in funding such programs. Funding that would ensure implementation rather than just discussion. Resources that transformed good intentions into practical protection. Money applied to systemic problems that affected thousands of families. Dealing with similar conflicts between elderly independence and family financial ambition. The afternoon brought visitors from the senior center where she had decided to volunteer. Teaching other elderly Americans how to recognize financial abuse disguised as family concern. How to identify early warning signs of guardianship schemes. How to access legal resources that could prevent exploitation. Mrs. Vance, we've seen a pattern. Pattern recognition that revealed the scope of elder abuse in communities across America. Family members who used aging as justification for asset seizure. Adult children who felt entitled to inheritance before parents died. Systems that enabled exploitation rather than prevention. The Harper Foundation could fund legal clinics. Legal aid that would provide representation for seniors who couldn't afford to fight guardianship proceedings. Attorneys who specialized in elder law rather than real estate transactions. Professional advocacy that prioritized client autonomy over family satisfaction. Educational seminars about financial protection. Education that would teach elderly Americans about their rights. Information that could prevent exploitation before crisis developed. Knowledge that empowered rather than frightened people who had been taught that aging meant surrender of independence. Support groups for families dealing with similar situations. Community that connected people facing comparable challenges. Understanding that came from shared experience rather than professional consultation. Healing that emerged through mutual support rather than isolated struggle. Evening brought phone calls from Mark, who had discovered that persistence couldn't overcome corporate security or legal protection. His voice had changed from anger to desperation to something approaching recognition that bridges burned in greed couldn't be rebuilt through geographical determination. Mom, I've been thinking about what happened. Thinking that came too late to prevent consequences he couldn't undo. Reflection that emerged only after schemes failed and alternatives disappeared. Consideration that was motivated by financial desperation rather than emotional growth. I made mistakes. Acknowledgement that didn't constitute apology. Recognition that avoided accountability. Admission that maintained innocence about intentions while conceding error in execution. Mark's version of remorse that protected his self-image while requesting forgiveness. I was trying to protect you. Protection that involved guardianship proceedings and competency evaluations and power of attorney documents that transferred all decision-making authority to someone who had already demonstrated willingness to steal family assets. Defense that required eliminating autonomy. I didn't understand how capable you still are. Capability that hadn't changed during the months he spent undermining her independence. Competence that had always existed but was inconvenient for his financial timeline. Ability that he had chosen to ignore rather than honestly evaluate. Maybe we could meet for coffee. Coffee that would provide opportunity for new schemes to replace failed guardianship strategies. Proximity that would enable different approaches to asset access. Reconciliation that would restore his position as heir rather than threat to her security. I miss you. Missing someone while continuing to treat them as property rather than person. Affection that was conditional on financial access. Love that required control over decisions that affected inheritance potential. Emotion that was measured in asset terms rather than relationship quality. Evelyn listened to the messages without returning calls. Communication that would only provide Mark with information he could use for continued harassment. Contact that would suggest forgiveness without requiring behavior change. Relationship that would enable future exploitation attempts. He sounds different. Liam's observation was accurate but insufficient. Different didn't mean changed. Modified tone didn't indicate transformed values. Adjusted approach didn't guarantee abandoned goals. Mark was adapting rather than evolving. Different strategies, same objectives. Understanding that came from experience with family members who viewed wealth as inheritance rather than responsibility. Children who measured affection in terms of access to assets. Sons and daughters who treated parents like investment opportunities rather than human beings. The legal protection holds. Corporate lawyers had constructed defenses that would withstand challenges Mark could afford to mount. Asset protection that prevented family manipulation. Marriage documentation that was legally unassailable despite personal motivations. Security that money could buy and maintain. What about forgiveness? Forgiveness doesn't require vulnerability. Wisdom that distinguished between emotional healing and practical protection. Understanding that grace could be extended without creating opportunities for repeated abuse. Love that could be offered without sacrificing security that had been earned through suffering. Harold would want you to forgive. Harold would want me to be safe. Truth about marriages that lasted long enough to accumulate deep knowledge about each other's priorities. Harold's kindness had been real, but his protectiveness was stronger. He would have chosen her security over Mark's feelings without hesitation. That weekend, they visited Harold's grave for the first time since the wedding. The headstone looked smaller than memory had preserved. Granite that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. Final resting place for someone whose love had created foundations strong enough to support transformation he never could have imagined. I kept my promise. Evelyn spoke to stone that represented promises made 40 years earlier. Vows about love and honor and cherishing that had been tested by illness and poverty and family betrayal. Commitments that had survived death through actions that honored values Harold had taught by example. I protected what we built together. Protection that required marriage to a stranger who became family. Security that demanded transformation from widow to wife. Defense that was achieved through partnership rather than isolation. Preservation that required change rather than resistance. I found someone who understands what you taught me. Understanding about love as behavior rather than sentiment. Knowledge about respect as foundation rather than luxury. Wisdom about protection as choice rather than control. Values that transcended death through application rather than memory. I'm not alone anymore. Companionship that honored Harold's memory while creating new possibilities. Partnership that respected the past while embracing the future. Security that was shared rather than dependent. Love that was chosen rather than inherited. The desert wind stirred leaves around Harold's grave. Natural sounds that had comforted him during evening walks they had taken together. Environmental music that continued playing after the audience had changed. Beauty that endured beyond the people who had appreciated it. He approves. Liam's voice carried certainty about things that couldn't be proven but felt true nonetheless. Harold would have wanted her protected. Would have approved of any solution that preserved her dignity and independence. Would have understood that love sometimes required accepting help from unexpected sources. He would like you. Truth about Harold's character that transcended death. His ability to recognize goodness in people regardless of their backgrounds or circumstances. His appreciation for integrity over wealth. His understanding that protecting someone meant defending their autonomy rather than controlling their choices. Monday brought the first board meeting of the Harper Foundation. Charitable work that would help other elderly Americans navigate systems designed to exploit rather than protect them. Legal aid for seniors facing guardianship abuse. Educational programs that taught families how love differed from control. Elder abuse affects 1 in 10 Americans over 60. Statistics that revealed the scope of family financial exploitation. Numbers that represented human suffering disguised as loving concern. Mathematics of betrayal that affected millions of families dealing with similar conflicts between elderly independence and relative financial ambition. Guardianship proceedings increased 40% last year. Legal trends that indicated systematic exploitation of vulnerable adults. Court challenges that were often motivated by asset seizure rather than legitimate concern. Judicial proceedings that frequently prioritized family convenience over individual autonomy. The Harper Foundation will fund legal defense programs. Resources applied to systemic problems that affected thousands of families. Money that would provide representation for seniors who couldn't afford to fight guardianship proceedings. Initiated by relatives with financial rather than protective motivations. Educational seminars about financial protection. Knowledge that would teach elderly Americans about their rights. Information that could prevent exploitation before crisis developed. Education that empowered rather than frightened people who had been taught that aging meant automatic surrender of independence. Support networks for families dealing with similar situations. Community that connected people facing comparable challenges. Understanding that came from shared experience rather than professional consultation. Healing that emerged through mutual support rather than isolated struggle against family members who had chosen money over relationship. The work felt meaningful in ways that transcended personal satisfaction. Purpose that transformed wealth from privilege into responsibility. Mission that honored Harold's memory while helping strangers he would never meet but whose welfare he would have prioritized if given the opportunity. This is what money should do. Liam's observation captured the difference between wealth as accumulation and wealth as tool. Resources applied to problems rather than hoarded for security. Assets that generated social benefit rather than personal advantage. Money that served humanity rather than exploiting it. Harold would understand. Understanding that came from shared values rather than shared experience. Appreciation for work that helped people rather than enriched shareholders. Respect for purposes that transcended profit to address human welfare. Approval for transformation that honored the past while creating better futures. That evening, they sat in Harold's garden watching vegetables grow in soil he had enriched with compost and care. Plants that continued producing life after his death. Seeds that honored his memory through abundance rather than monument. Living legacy that fed people rather than preserving property. What comes next? We keep building. Building on foundations Harold had established. Building on values that transcended wealth to address character. Building on love that was demonstrated through behavior rather than sentiment. Building on protection that was shared rather than hoarded. What about Mark? Mark will need to build his own life. Recognition that children eventually faced consequences of choices that destroyed family relationships for financial gain. Understanding that some bridges burned in greed couldn't be rebuilt through persistent apology. Acceptance that love couldn't be restored through contact that ignored accountability. Maybe someday he'll understand that family means more than money. Hope that remained possible despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Faith that people could change when consequences finally motivated reflection. Love that continued existing without requiring vulnerability to further exploitation. The sun set across Phoenix with colors that painted the desert in shades Harold had loved during evening walks they had taken together. Natural beauty that continued despite human drama. Environmental constancy that provided perspective about problems that felt overwhelming but were actually manageable. I'm grateful. Gratitude that encompassed Harold's legacy and Liam's protection and transformation. That had exceeded her ability to imagine possibility during the darkest months of widow struggle. Thankfulness for survival that had become service. Appreciation for love that had been redefined through partnership rather than romance. I'm grateful too. Mutual appreciation for protection that served both parties. Shared recognition that marriage had provided security for two people whose families had chosen exploitation over support. Partnership that had generated benefits neither could have achieved alone. The future stretched ahead like desert highways that connected familiar places with unknown destinations. Corporate responsibilities that would challenge someone still learning how wealth functioned. Charitable work that would help strangers facing similar family betrayals. Marriage that would continue evolving as partnership deepened through shared experience. But tonight was peaceful in ways that had seemed impossible during the months when bills arrived. Daily and prescription bottles sat empty and Mark's schemes threatened the independence Harold had spent 40 years creating. Security that was shared rather than solitary. Protection that was chosen rather than imposed. Love that was demonstrated through respect rather than control. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything I went through means something today. Harold's house stood solid in the desert night. Windows glowed with lights that welcomed rather than isolated. Rooms that had echoed with loneliness now hummed with purpose. Spaces that had felt like prisons during Mark's financial siege had been transformed into headquarters for work that gave meaning to wealth beyond accumulation. The garden bloomed with vegetables that fed both body and soul. Soil that Harold had enriched with his hands continued supporting life after his death. Seeds that he had helped plant still produced abundance that sustained not just survival but service to others facing similar challenges. Mrs. Chen's porch light flickered goodnight across the space between houses that had become symbols of community rather than isolation. Neighbors who had witnessed Mark's schemes now observed their defeat. Elderly empowerment that proved age didn't eliminate autonomy when supported by resources and respect. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. The marriage certificate lay in Harold's desk drawer next to insurance policies and will documents and legal papers that protected rather than exploited. Evidence of decisions made in desperation that had led to salvation neither could have predicted. Proof that love could be based on respect rather than romance. On partnership rather than passion. On choice rather than chance. Thank you for spending this time with me. Mark's guardianship schemes had generated consequences that would follow him for years. His mother had escaped before he could complete the financial theft he had planned for months. Bridges burned in greed couldn't be rebuilt through geographic persistence or modified approaches that served the same exploitative goals. The transformation was complete. The escape was successful. The future was protected. Justice had been served through resources applied to family dysfunction. Love had been redefined as behavior rather than sentiment. Family had been rebuilt on choice rather than obligation. The Harper Foundation would help thousands of elderly Americans navigate systems designed to exploit rather than protect them. Legal aid that provided representation for seniors who couldn't afford to fight guardianship proceedings initiated by relatives with financial motivations. Educational programs that taught families how caring differed from controlling. And in Harold's garden, vegetables continued growing in soil enriched by love that transcended death. Seeds that honored memory through abundance rather than monument. Living legacy that fed people rather than preserving property. Life that continued not because it was easy, but because